just go ahead and dive in and start explaining that concept, Jonathan.
That's a big part of how Wall Street's been running us into a ditch for the last 30 years.
The debt ceiling is not some sort of macroeconomic concept.
The U.S. isn't really a great place, and it's not really the land of the free.
Get 1,000 people together and let's go lay siege to City Hall.
Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We have a fantastic show for you all. As always, lots of important things to discuss. We're going to talk about how BlackRock is engaging in greenwashing on a massive scale. We're going to talk a little bit about Noam Chomsky's warnings pertaining to Ukraine. We're going to talk about the ceasefire that has occurred in Yemen, a temporary ceasefire, albeit, but we're going to get into some of those details. One big story I am not going to cover, I wish I could, is the situation in Pakistan, where their prime minister has recently been ousted. That is just not something I have followed closely enough to give any sort of meaningful opinion on. It's something I'm going to try to study up on this week and hopefully bring you guys a segment on Pakistan's situation next week. But we have other stories to get into. The Buffalo cops who shoved the old man during the Black Lives Matter protests have gotten off, as you know, predictably, with no punishment whatsoever. We have another thread from Alec Karakatsanis describing how the New York Times engages in propaganda. We're going to talk about Eric Kessner, Real Progressives colleague Eric Kessner, and his journey in Washington, D.C. He participated in some events for student debt with Afeni, who regular viewers will recognize. She's been on this program before. We have some climate stuff to talk about. Matt Stoller put out a clip on antitrust laws and the Biden administration's position on antitrust. We're going to dive into some of those details. We're going to talk about the anti-trans bill in Alabama, something that we're seeing all over the country at this point that is absolutely egregious and outrageous. We have a labor update, as always, lots of clips from More Perfect Union, an article from More Perfect Union pertaining to Starbucks as well as congressional staffers. And we also have a piece in The Lever, David Sirota's outlet, talking about Amazon. So lots of great stuff to get to today, you guys. I did also want to quickly plug. Some of you, I'm sure, watched the summits that we participated in, the March for Medicare for All summits a few weekends ago. They are engaging in another raffle with an awesome basket. This is to help raise money for an event this July 30th, another event for National Improved Medicare for All. This is going to be in Washington, D.C., and it's going to be preceded by a week of action as well. So I encourage everybody to, donate to M for All and also participate in this raffle. You can get all sorts of fantastic goodies there, as you can see on the screen. So first story that I wanted to get into today, you guys. This is, oh my gosh, I almost forgot the basic plug. Realprogressives.org for all of our fantastic content. Realprogressives.org/donate if you'd like to help us out. We are a nonprofit. You can find all sorts of articles, podcasts, great content at realprogressives.org. If you'd like to get involved, volunteer, or donate, please go to our website. Now we can go ahead and dive into the first story here. This is in Mediaite. And I thought this was just interesting in terms of the framing on some of this stuff. This is about how the Democrats are likely completely screwed this November and likely to get mollywopped. Democratic strategists speak out ahead of midterms. We're going to get slaughtered in November. Now, what's fascinating to me is that the big picture take is obviously correct. The Democrats are going to get slaughtered in November, almost no matter what. But the framing on why, it's coming from a very centrist perspective, and I want to point some of that out here. So, a number of Democratic Party strategists spoke to the Hill 7 months ahead of the November midterms. One of them concluded the party is doomed. With record gas prices and 4-decade high inflation prices, some Americans out of basic commodities, party insiders weighed in. The consensus was President Joe Biden and Democrats are in serious trouble. Worried about not only losing a majority in the House, but also in the Senate, top strategists spoke of the issues Democrats face in convincing Americans to turn out and vote for them in the fall. Bill Galston, who advised former President Bill Clinton, you guys can already see which angle they're coming at this from, said Biden's approval numbers can only go so high right now. Quote, my hypothesis is unless and until inflation comes down appreciably, that there's going to be a ceiling on his job approval that's a lot lower than the White House wants it to be, Galston said. Gallup senior editor Jeff Jones concurred, quote, high gas prices are one of the biggest anchors on presidential approval, Jones said. Biden's approval rating is hovering at around 40%. The Real Clear Politics average shows 41% approve of Biden's job performance, while 53.8% disapprove. The Biden administration has repeatedly attempted to attribute pain at the pump to Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. There was a consensus among experts that the message is not helping the president with voters. Quote, "I'm not shocked at all by the numbers because they look exactly what normal looks like," said Jim Kessler, who is executive VP for policy at the think tank Third Way. If you don't know Third Way, they are kind of the corporate centrist side of the Democratic Party. The question is, given a lot of the good news in the country, the jobs numbers, this is an exaggeration, obviously, businesses opening, the masks are off, the Russians are in full panic, America is astride the top of the world. Can we do better? Can we do better than normal? And I think the disappointment right now is we're not. Obviously, the framing on that is ridiculous, you guys. I mean, I get up here and cover every day how that is not the case. The country is not thriving at this moment. People are in economic pain. The pandemic is still going on despite capital and big businesses' attempts to persuade the powers that be otherwise, and despite Biden and his administration's tendency to allow them to sway their public policy on this issue, right, and pretend that the pandemic is over. All of this from Jim is basically complete and utter nonsense, and that is to be expected from Third Way. One strategist who was not named attempted to stamp out any hope Democrats will be able to fend off Republicans at the polls later this year. Quote, "It's bad," a person only described as a Democratic strategist said. "You have an energy crisis that's paralyzing, and inflation is at a 40-year high, and we're heading into a recession. The problem is simple. The American people have lost confidence in him." Quote, "Everyone needs to come to terms with the reality that we're going to get slaughtered in November," the Democratic strategist said. "That's a fact. Biden's polling has gotten worse, not better. It's indicative of the fact that people have lost confidence in his leadership. There's nothing they're going to be able to do." And that last line kind of gets me, you guys. Notice the assumption that's made there. The assumption is that Biden and Democrats will not follow through on any of their promises that could actually help them at the polls in November. So the assumption is because they're going to do nothing, they're going to get slaughtered in November, and there's nothing they can do. But see how that's like framed in such a weird way? They're literally the ones in power. Just a few things Biden could do without even having to engage in any sort of political fight. Biden could cancel student debt with the flick of a pen. He could even just cancel large portions of student debt for each individual borrower with the flick of a pen. Instead, his education department and his justice department continue to appeal cases where courts have found in favor of people trying to discharge their student loan debt through bankruptcy proceedings. And of course, Biden very famously was one of the senators who led the charge to make it virtually impossible to discharge your student debt through bankruptcy. Another thing he could do is legalize marijuana at least. And, if I got my way, it would be all drugs and release all the nonviolent drug offenders and all this kind of stuff. That would not only... I take the Portugal model. It would not only cut down on substance abuse, making your society directly healthier, right? People struggling less, but it would also obviously cut in at least a little bit to some of the racist and abusive aspects of our criminal justice system. It would be a win-win. It's wildly popular. Some 70% of people support releasing nonviolent drug offenders. You can then take those local funds that are currently going to police and prisons and jails, and you can reallocate them to educating about substance abuse, providing rehab facilities, providing housing, providing robust mental health services, etc., which actually will cut into these problems and help people's lives. Okay. And again, wildly popular. Biden could do it. He simply chooses not to. Instead, he has increased subsidies for police. And we have a few police stories to get into today as well. There are all sorts of things that he could have done or could do going forward between now and November that are wildly popular, that do not require the approval of Congress. The Social Security Act gives him the ability to implement a new healthcare program by declaring an emergency during the pandemic. He has refused to touch healthcare at all during a deadly pandemic where 800,000 Americans have lost their lives. He won't touch it. We can just keep going on and on about the broken promises, the inadequacy, the lack of follow through from the Biden administration, and the fact that this strategist unnamed strategist, says there's nothing they're going to be able to do. There's tons that they could do, and each of these would individually move the needle in their favor, but they totally refuse because they don't actually want to, and that is the problem. So I thought that kind of built-in assumption in that framing was quite fascinating, and I'm kind of also fascinated by the fact that though I think that the sources for this article are wrong in the details of their analysis here, they seem to have gotten the big picture correct, which is Democrats are going to get absolutely boat raced, and everybody who's paying even a modicum of attention seems to know that at this point. So yet another reason, by the way, you guys, if Democrats are serious, if Joe Biden and his administration and Democratic leadership, if they're serious about any of the platform issues, like any of their platform, if they're serious about wanting to implement any of the policies that they put in their platform, they would do it now before they don't have power. But again, they just won't do that. They'll sit on their hands until November, and then they'll blame the left and they'll bitch and moan about it. Totally incoherently blame the left, by the way. And you know, Biden, it's interesting because he's tried to walk this line that I think has done him no services at all. He tries to like rhetorically or performatively appear as though he is friendly with the progressives in Congress, and yet he does nothing of substance to help that agenda get passed, right? So what you end up doing there is you give the conservatives the ammunition to scream socialist and communist and attach him to AOC and whatever, because he rhetorically wants to be friendly to them for his own electoral reasons, to try to turn out the young voters and try to energize the Democratic base, right? And yet, despite providing Republicans with the ammunition to attack you and red bait you over that, you don't get any of the benefits of leftist politics. The benefits would be, hey, we're passing policy after policy that has 70, 80% approval. We're giving you healthcare. We're giving you education. We're giving you housing. We're improving social services. We're improving mental health services, right? We're getting people out of jail who don't belong in jail. If you can go out to the public and say those things, you will be popular no matter how much Mitt Romney wants to call you a communist, right? So, but what Biden's done is he's tried to walk this line in a way that allows the right to criticize him the same way they would if he was actually engaging in these progressive policy reforms. So, I don't know. I think it's a losing strategy. I think he has kind of picked a losing lane here, and that matters a lot less than the substance of the actual policies here, obviously. But I thought it was very interesting how these Democratic strategists approached the issue of the midterms this coming year, and I wanted to make sure to show you guys that story. So next up here, we have a story about BlackRock and how they're engaging in greenwashing. This is all too common for financial firms and corporations and even fossil fuel and energy companies to do, where they portray themselves as an ally when it comes to combating the climate crisis, and instead they are basically just profiting off of it from all possible angles, right? So I have a clip I want to show you guys here. This is the Breaking Points does a weekly segment with The Lever, David Sirota's outlet. And this is a reporter I had not heard of before named, I'm sorry, where is it? Adam Lowenstein. Adam Lowenstein, who writes for The Lever, he wrote about BlackRock here and their greenwashing, and went on Breaking Points to discuss his piece. We'll watch this clip, come back and discuss.
It's time now for our weekly partnership segment with The Lever. Joining us for the first time this week, we have Adam Lowenstein. He has written a great piece for The Lever. He also writes Reframe Your Inbox, which is an email newsletter of essays and interviews about corporate power, capitalism, and politics. Definitely sounds like something I would be into. Great to see you, Adam. Welcome.
Good to see you, man.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go ahead and put up this piece that you wrote for The Lever, which I think is really interesting and very relevant about BlackRock. You say here, for BlackRock, the climate crisis is a win-win-win. No matter how or whether governments tackle climate change, the world's biggest asset manager has positioned itself to cash in. So just break down here for us your reporting.
Absolutely. So let's start with the first win, which is the status quo. And we know right now BlackRock is investing a ton of money in oil, gas, and coal and other dirty assets and industries and technologies. By their own calculations, they're making money off some $260 billion worth of fossil fuel investments. That's as of last summer. So that could have increased since then. But BlackRock is also making a ton of money off sustainable investments. By their own calculations, they manage more than $500 billion worth of assets and investment products that have been deemed or marketed as sustainable and environmentally friendly. So these are two big cash cows for BlackRock, and that's just the status quo. The second win, if governments do decide to take more meaningful action on climate change, because of all of the rhetoric and all of the PR that BlackRock has done, Larry Fink's annual letters are always a hot topic in the business world. And he makes these big sweeping claims about how BlackRock is going to be tackling climate change, and that because governments have failed, businesses need to step in and step up, neglecting to mention, of course, that some of the reasons that governments have been unable to tackle global challenges like climate change is because of really effective business lobbying against solutions. But even having said that, if governments do take more meaningful action, BlackRock has been so effective at positioning itself as a responsible and serious and good faith actor in the climate discussion that when the negotiating table is set up, BlackRock is probably going to have a seat at it. And what that means is that BlackRock might be advocating for solutions to climate change that benefit the company and as well as society, but BlackRock is never going to sign off on any solution that is good for society, but bad for the company, which right off the bat limits the number of possible solutions to the small number that are good for companies like BlackRock. And then the third win is that because of all this talk and this PR and all this rhetoric about, being a good faith actor and taking climate change seriously and working together, BlackRock is already winning. No matter what governments do or don't do, the company has secured a reputation as this effective climate partner, which means that all of the money from sustainable and ESG investments, which are growing, astronomically, a lot of that's going to keep flowing to BlackRock.
So, Adam, at the heart of this is ESG, which you mentioned. Explain that a little bit to the audience and why it's a scam.
Sure. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's often you hear it in the context of ESG investing, although ESG, like a lot of acronyms, has kind of just come to symbolize everything about businesses taking meaningful action to save the world, basically. And you have seen, by some estimates, there's $35 trillion of assets that are labeled ESG. Some estimates say that this could grow up to $50 trillion in the next few years. And basically what ESG investing says is that you can use your money and you can make money and you can also save the world at the same time. And a lot of times there's a few problems with it. Number one, there's no real standardization for what ESG means. And there's an announcement from the SEC a few weeks ago that they're going to start rolling out some proposed climate disclosure rules, which actually might start to standardize what some of these ESG labels mean. But for the most part, what it means is that different asset managers and institutional investors like BlackRock can offer products that they claim are good for society, good for human rights, good for diversity and inclusion, good for the climate, and basically imply to investors, which could be individual investors, it could be pension funds, it could be other companies. Basically, what they're saying is that you put your money into these ESG funds and you don't really need to do anything else because your money is going to make the world a better place. And that's a very seductive idea. It's very comforting. It would be nice if we could just let companies and capitalism solve, the world's problems for us. But because there is this implied and sometimes very explicit claim that ESG investments will also be better for the bottom line than traditional investments, then once again, similar to BlackRock saying, we're going to be at the table and so we're going to rule out all the solutions that aren't good for our business. If you have an ESG product that maybe is good for society but isn't making as much money as a traditional mutual fund, which could be invested in all sorts of companies like Exxon and Chevron and Facebook and all of these companies that you could make a pretty compelling argument are not good for society. If these ESG funds don't make as much money as the other ones, then they're just not going to gain traction. And so on top of that, you have a lot of ESG funds that are just labeled environmental or sustainable or green, and they're full of stocks like Exxon and Chevron, oil and gas companies. And we've seen this a lot over the last 6 weeks or so following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You have a lot of ESG funds that hold shares in Russian companies, including Russian oil and gas.
What are, based on what we know BlackRock's holdings, what are some of the climate solutions that they might find acceptable? Like, okay, we're going to make money off of that one. And what do you think are some of the things they would push out of the bounds of conversation?
Yeah, so in the piece, I talk about this speech that Larry Fink gave Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, gave at the G20 last summer in Italy. And he outlined a few of the solutions that he wants to see. One of those is that he wants to see more scrutiny for state-run and privately held companies. There's a lot of scrutiny for publicly traded companies about what they're doing on the environment or what they're not doing, what they're doing on human rights or what they're not doing. And Larry Fink wants to see more scrutiny for privately held companies and for state-run companies, which is legit. There are a lot of public companies that are offloading dirty assets to private companies. They're just selling them or to state-run companies. And that doesn't, as Larry Fink himself has said, that doesn't actually make the world any greener or more sustainable. It just shifts who holds those assets to less heavily scrutinized entities. But it's also a very convenient argument for BlackRock, because if you have less scrutiny on public companies like BlackRock and more scrutiny on other firms, well, that means less scrutiny for BlackRock. It's right there in the statement. But what it also hides is the fact that BlackRock itself, while calling for more scrutiny for privately held and state-run companies, BlackRock is continuing to partner with and invest in privately held and state-run companies. They just announced a big investment coalition with a bunch of investors who invested in a $15 billion pipeline project with Saudi Aramco. Obviously, a massive company and a state-run company out of Saudi Arabia. BlackRock, I mentioned a couple of places in the piece. BlackRock is investing in pipelines in Texas with privately held energy and infrastructure companies. So that's one argument that they make, where there's some truth to it, but it's also a very convenient argument for the company. Another solution that BlackRock would like to see is governments investing trillions and trillions of dollars in lowering what Larry Fink calls the green premium, the fact that a lot of green industries and technologies and products are more expensive than traditional ones, non-green ones. And again, there's a kernel of truth to that. There is definitely a role to play for governments to help spark the initial upfront investment. There's a lot of private capital is not necessarily going to move into these spaces without governments bearing some of the upfront risk. But once again, this is a very, very convenient argument for BlackRock to make, because, as Larry Fink has said, there's a long-term investment possibility of $50 trillion worth of green investments. And that's a pretty lucrative pot of money for the world's biggest long-term investor, BlackRock, to be eyeing.
Right.
So
excellent reporting there from Adam Lowenstein of The Lever. And you notice, guys, how these companies don't care how they're bringing the money in. If they can profit off of something that appears green or environmental, they're all too happy to. It not only is still money coming in, it's still profits. It also allows them, it sort of arms their ability to portray themselves as allies to the environmental movement. And of course, as Adam went into there, it's complete and utter nonsense. A lot of these, there's a lot of connections here with Exxon and with these big energy companies and things that are nonetheless labeled as though they're environmental investments and the ESGs. I think if you are relying on the profit incentive happening to line up with the incentives of people who want to address the climate crisis and environmental activists, if you're thinking you can just make that profit incentive line up and somehow cut into this problem, I think you're not properly diagnosing the problem. I think the profit incentive itself is the problem here. And it's what guides companies that decide to destroy the planet knowingly for short-term profit. So, you may be able to go hand pick your instances where it's like, okay, big company invested in some sort of actually environmental escapade, but that's just a happenstance in a moment. They're just, they're no less likely to turn around and invest in something that is far from environmentally friendly, and they all do so. So I just want to caution people against allowing that kind of greenwashing to influence your perception of these, financial giants who are a humongous part of the problem. BlackRock is a humongous part of the problem. So, and that last point is Larry Fink obviously seems to recognize here an opportunity, 50 trillion potential over the next decade in this green energy infrastructure, right? So what he sees is money. He doesn't give a fuck about what happens to the planet. He sees money, and he sees an opportunity to portray himself and his company as good guys. And that's just something a capitalist always loves, right? That's something Larry Fink is never not going to jump at. So be very wary of these gigantic financial institutions and corporations that try to portray themselves as environmental allies. Just be very, very wary of it, you guys. It honestly, it reminds me of how some companies will try to take advantage of social movements, right? One thing that bothers me more than anything is when you see like a pride flag just for Pride Month up in some institution that has long discriminated against the LGBTQ community, right? They get to be totally hypocritical and like exploit social movements for profit while they've long been or continue to be part of the problem. And I see a very similar dynamic here with the greenwashing and how banks and energy firms and big oil companies and corporations and, all sorts of industries that engage in the destruction of the planet for profit are going to try to frame and market all of this. So again, great reporting there from The Lever, and I encourage you all to be very wary of those kinds of narratives. So this is just a really funny story, you guys. I cannot help myself but cover this, quite frankly. CNN Plus launched, and it was disastrous, like absolutely disastrous, as we've all been on the left predicting for months and months and months, right? CNN Plus, for those that don't know, is CNN's attempt to go into the streaming game and the podcast game. Immediately following their launch, they had to drop their prices substantially to try to bring in more subscribers. They spent some $250 million marketing this new CNN Plus platform. And what they've got so far is 18,000 subscribers. You guys, what do I even say to that? I'm not trying to get up on my high horse. I'll get a few hundred views on my live streams. It's not like I'm getting some massive viewership, but I'm also algorithmically oppressed in a way that CNN is not. And I also, for those at home, this might be shocking to you, but I don't have a $250 million advertising budget. We at RP do not spend that kind of money marketing our content only to come up with 18,000 subscribers. So I just find this, entirely hilarious. The only reason that independent content creators have any sort of an ability to bring in an audience at all is because of precisely how awful the mainstream media is. And CNN doesn't seem to understand that at all. This is in TechCrunch. CNN Plus's launch may be off to a bumpy start, numbers suggest. CNN Plus launched on Tuesday, March 29th, and is already showing mediocre results in terms of standalone mobile app installs. Sensor Tower released its initial figures, first reported by Insider, that showed the CNN app, which now houses the new streaming service, added about 18,000 installs on the day of the launch. During the 7 days ending March 22nd, it had an average of 9,000 installs per day. CNN's new service includes a mix of daily news panels and documentaries such as The Land of the Giants, Titans of Tech, The Murdochs, Empire of Influence, as well as CNN anchors Anderson Cooper, Wolf Blitzer, Don Lemon, and Jake Tapper, and more. I mean, I just can't even help but laugh at that being written as though it's some sort of promotion. Wolf Blitzer? Who the fuck at home is like, where's Wolf Blitzer's content? I don't get enough of him. Oh, my goodness gracious. The subscription only costs $5.99 per month. They dropped it, though. Plus, CNN is offering a limited time deal and is giving new subscribers 50% off the standard monthly plan for a lifetime, which is just $2.99 per month. When you have to drop your price, cut your price in half right off the bat, it's not a good sign. Not great. Not great stuff, especially when you spend $250 million advertising the product. The company has gone all in on the service, throwing a pricey launch event at South by Southwest and running an ad during the Oscars broadcast where spots cost as much as $2.2 million. Ahead of the launch, CNN Plus spent approximately $322,000 in 2021, per Cantor's estimates noted by Insider. One person familiar with the numbers informed her that overall, Warner Media spent around $100 million to market CNN Plus, which is more than what the network typically spends in a year on marketing. A CNN executive said the launch budget was around $250 million. There's the number I keep citing. By comparison, Disney spent some $135 million in TV advertising for Disney Plus in the first half of 2020, according to eMarketer. So listen, it's always fun to be able to laugh at CNN, right? And their lack of understanding of why they can't seem to retain their audience or bring in any new viewership in target demographics at all. They basically thrive on people like 55 and up, and that is it. And you know, it's no sign of success to have a bunch of people basically leave your network on their television while they go about their day paying almost no attention to it, which seems to be a large portion of their reported viewership on their regular network. But guys, 18,000 on your first day when you've spent $250 million on a product. I mean, can you imagine the humiliation? Just imagine. Pick your favorite leftist commentator, right? Someone on the left who's independent, doesn't get a whole ton of views. Maybe they're popular, but they don't get a whole ton of views. Imagine if they had $250 million to market their product. Where would they be right now, right? This totally disproves the notion of meritocracy, right? like CNN and cable news totally disprove that notion. They get their high viewers. I mean, they're tanking proportionally, right, compared to what they should be putting up. But they get a lot more viewers than a lot of independent sources do. But they suck so bad that whenever they have to come into a market where they actually have to compete, where they don't have a monopoly over it, they end up slammed, even though they've spent all this money on marketing. 18,000 subscribers, you guys. And by the way, that's only the people that added the app. A lot of those people, that's actually an overestimate because that's not subscriber totals. A lot of those people may have just downloaded the app, noticed that the subscription was going to cost them a monthly fee and said, fuck that. So who knows how many of those 18 actually even subscribed to the content. That's just who downloaded the app. What an embarrassment. What an absolute embarrassment. We in independent media thank CNN for their incompetence and for sending their viewers our way. And I'll continue to cover that story just because I get a kick out of it and I get a little bit of schadenfreude out of seeing CNN and their demise. So I want to talk a little bit here about Noam Chomsky, and he gave a long interview. One of the things that they discussed was Ukraine, and he had a very interesting quote on that I wanted to bring to you all. This is in the New Statesman. Noam Chomsky, we're approaching the most dangerous point in human history. The U.S. professor, now 93, on the climate catastrophe and the threat of nuclear war. This is by George Eaton. I'm going to skip over the start because I just want to get to this quote. They talked about a whole bunch of things. Here we go. The occasion for our conversation is the publication of Chronicles of Dissent, a collection of interviews between Chomsky and the radical journalist David Barsemian from 1984 to 1996, but the backdrop is the war in Ukraine, a subject about which Chomsky is unsurprisingly voluble. It's monstrous for Ukraine, he said. In common with many Jews, Chomsky has a family connection to the region. His father was born in present-day Ukraine and emigrated to the U.S. in 1913 to avoid serving in the Tsarist army. His mother was born in Belarus. Chomsky, who is often accused by critics of refusing to condemn any anti-Western government, unhesitantly denounced Vladimir Putin's criminal aggression. But he added, why did he do it? There are two ways of looking at this question. One way, the fashionable way in the West, is to plumb the recesses of Putin's twisted mind and try to determine what's happening in his deep psyche. The other way would be to look at the facts. For example, that in September 2021, the United States came out with a strong policy statement calling for enhanced military cooperation with Ukraine, further sending of advanced military weapons, all part of the enhancement program of Ukraine joining NATO. You can take your choice. We don't know which is right. What we do know is that Ukraine will be further devastated, and we may move on to terminal nuclear war if we do not pursue the opportunities that exist for a negotiated settlement. I just love the way he says right up front, the fashionable way in the West to think about it is, well, look how delusional Putin is, right? And you guys, again, like I pretty much agree with Chomsky's position on this. I in no way condone or justify or support Putin's invasion. I unequivocally condemn it. But the context and the facts and the U.S. involvement over the last 8 years, the fighting that's been going on in eastern Ukraine for the last 8 years, all of that gets totally left out of the discussion. Arming of neo-Nazis gets totally left out of the discussion. A coup that we helped instigate in 2014 all gets totally left out of the discussion, right? And even, I mean, George Kennan, who was the architect of the containment strategy, right? Very, very hawkish guy on foreign policy. Even he has acknowledged that of course what we've done with NATO expansion is aggression. I mean, it's, you know, even freaking Henry Kissinger has acknowledged this, you guys, like the epitome of hawkishness in foreign policy. He has come out and even said, you know, obviously it's aggression to continue moving NATO towards Russia's border. Chomsky had a quote from years ago when he was on Democracy Now! And he said it wouldn't matter who the Russian leader is, they would be responding to this how Putin has responded to this. Now, again, that's not about the invasion. This is from a handful of years ago. But Putin taking the NATO expansion as aggression is hardly surprising. When we're talking about international issues, you guys, and foreign policy issues, I think people make this mistake of viewing the world through good guy, bad guy sort of false dichotomy. And you really just have to accept that there are a whole lot of actors on the world stage and powerful people who are not good faith actors. And when you're engaging in analysis of dynamics between a number of bad faith actors, you come to very different conclusions than if you view the world through this black and white, there's a good guy and there's a bad guy analysis, right? So I really encourage everybody to like consider context, right? Instead of thinking of an explanation as a justification, just think of it as an explanation. Here's the history here. Here's what actually occurred over the last decade that may have led us to the point that we're at. That doesn't justify anybody's action. It's just, here are the facts. So I really encourage everybody to take a little bit more of a nuanced view on international relations. And that very much includes the war in Ukraine right now. And I thought Chomsky put that very well. The fashionable way to talk about this in the West, right, is basically to leave all the context out and plumb, what did he say, plumb Putin's delusional mind or something like that, plumb the recesses of, like that is the way the West, they reduce it to that. They simplify it down to Putin bad, NATO good. And I just want to encourage everybody to reject that framing because I think it's absolute nonsense. And along kind of the similar lines, you guys, I know this is an aspect of this that I've covered previously, but I just want to keep it front and center. This is in Jacobin. For arms manufacturers, the war in Ukraine is a profits bonanza. Not even 1% of NATO military hardware will actually be used to help Ukraine, but the Russian invasion has provided a pretext for massively increasing arms spending, and it's great news for weapons manufacturers' profits. I'm not going to get into that piece. I just wanted to show you guys the headline to kind of keep front and center. The military-industrial complex is at the heart of a lot of this, and the profits of the powerful are at the heart of a lot of this. So always remember who's benefiting from different policy decisions rather than simply accepting the justification that the powerful people provide you for their policy decisions. Look a little bit deeper and follow the money. And, I just encourage you all to look at these things in a slightly more nuanced way than the Western press wants to present them. So some of you will remember, I'm going to show you the clip here, Buffalo cops shoving an old man during the BLM protests. Those cops unsurprisingly getting off scot-free. This is just a quick clip to remind you all, his name's Martin Gugino, and he was assaulted by Buffalo cops who have now been let off for this. So we'll watch this clip, and then I have an article to show you guys. So the arbiter has found that was okay, that was acceptable. This is in the Buffalo News, and I just want to condemn, here we go. I just want to condemn the mainstream press for, like, literally, you guys, I could not even find a single national outlet that wrote a single piece about this. That's why I am using the Buffalo News. Buffalo cops who pushed protester Martin Gugino to ground cleared of wrongdoing. The way that's framed too, cleared of wrongdoing. No, an arbiter got it wrong. Let's frame it right. 2 Buffalo police officers who knocked a 75-year-old protester to the ground, causing him to suffer a head injury during a 2020 protest and drawing national criticism, were cleared Friday of wrongdoing by an arbiter. Arbiter Jeffrey M. Selchik said he found that officers Aaron Torgalski and Robert McCabe did not violate police department regulations and did not intend to injure Martin Gugino during the protest outside City Hall on June 4th of 2020. Torgalski and McCabe testified before the arbiter that they were trying to protect themselves and denied that they were trying to hurt Gugino. Arbiter says that the use of physical force was absolutely legitimate, who added that Gugino was definitely not an innocent bystander. You guys saw the clip. Decide for yourself. Was that defense on behalf of those officers? You got dozens of cops in riot gear, and then you got one old man. Did they need to be defended? I mean, are you fucking kidding me? Like, these cops want to be respected as tough guys who make sacrifices for society and who put their lives on the line. And then they say that one old man threatened dozens of them in riot gear with weapons. How pathetic, how cowardly. And yet they want your respect. I mean, what do you even say about that? It's a continuation of our criminal justice system serving exactly who it's designed to serve. I'll mention again, as I always do when we cover police, that they were born out of slave catchers. That star that you see sheriffs wearing on their badge, that originated as the slave catcher badge. And anytime that you want to stand up against their racist practices or against their oppressive practices, their violence that they inflict upon society, the crimes they commit against the society that they're sworn to protect and serve, anytime you want to point any of that out, object to it, protest it, demonstrate against it, they come at you in full force. They'll shove an old man down and crack his freaking head open, and then they'll get off scot-free because our justice system is an absolute fucking joke. We all know how this goes. It's an all too familiar story. You know, the exception to the rule is George Floyd, when Derek Chauvin was actually convicted. Now, of course, I think he should have been convicted of first-degree murder. I think that's obvious when you kneel on someone's neck for that long. It's obvious first-degree murder. Even in, they even get the reduced charges, the lower level charges. So cops get away with whatever the hell they want in this country. And Joe Biden, who said he would try to reform police, who said that he would address the violence and the racism in policing and in the justice system, has decided instead to increase subsidies for police and do absolutely nothing to change the way his justice system behaves on these issues. It's really quite sad. In a very related note, I have a thread here from Alec Karakatsanis, who's become somewhat of a regular contributor to the show via his Twitter. As always, encourage you all to follow his work at Equality Alec. He says, thread, the New York Times has written another story about crime in New York City that does not once mention the concepts of poverty, inequality, medical care, housing, education, or availability of guns. It's a remarkable pattern of propaganda. I try to explain more about it below. For background, today's article is supposedly about how perceptions of rising crime, despite homicides going down, are creating anxiety that New York City might be regressing to a violent past. As always, let me list for you the sources identified in the article in chronological order. You can always tell so much about who planted a story and whose perspective is being shared and why when you look at the New York Times stories. What do you notice? Police officials, commissioner, professor, the police department, officials, chief of detectives. The article is a case study in two forms of propaganda. One, it emphasizes a narrow concept of safety that centers what cops report, not what causes the most harm. And two, it suggests that policing has some significant impact on those narrow harms, absent any evidence at all. First, one reason that perceptions of crime lead to anxiety, again, is that news urgently focuses on tiny range of harms that cops report as crime, but don't cover with urgency broader threats to safety that are far more important. He links a thread there that he did previously. And so people become obsessed with index crimes, but don't push officials on far greater threats to well-being like wage theft, illegal air water pollution, tax evasion, illegal eviction, etc. Powerful interests spend massive dollars to make sure cops and media don't focus on this. Second, this entire article, from its themes to its quotes and sources, simply allows cops to claim that their actions have some effect on things like murders and shootings and subway assaults. There's no evidence offered for this and no skepticism from the reporters. Remarkably, there is not a gesture by reporters that the scientific literature has a consensus. I'm sorry, I misread that. There is not a gesture by reporters that the scientific literature has a consensus that other factors like poverty, inequality, education, healthcare, housing, etc. are more linked with these phenomena. Incredible omission, but cops don't want us thinking about this. Finally, the article has a number of other bizarre propaganda classics, talking about revival of notorious brutal criminal gangs of plainclothes police officers. Article says, quote, the new units have been reimagined to include training on constitutional rights and de-escalation. What does it mean to reimagine units found to have been rampantly committing federal felony assault crimes against the poorest people in New York City for years and lying about it? What about evidence that de-escalation and constitutional rights trainings have never worked? Omitted. It's all part of a pattern in the media of letting cops make baseless claims that what they do impacts crime, and that cops are always and forever working hard on vague, i.e. ludicrous, training reforms that never actually change what they do. Then the article just ends with a seemingly random story the cops gave to the New York Times about one person's arrest. What is the news value of this? The value to the cops is clear. It makes people think that the police are working hard to make us safe. History and science be damned. As I've said before, reporting like this will not only trap us with violent, ineffective police bureaucracies, but it actively pushes us along a path to more and more technologically sophisticated and overt authoritarianism, and we're running out of time. Since that was a heavy, here's a photo of a beautiful bird I saw from the park bench as I wrote this thread. There is still time to create a better world. Alec always ends his threads with a picture of his cat or some animal or something cool that he saw. Again, @Equality Alec on Twitter. I really encourage you all to follow his work. He does fantastic work. He's an attorney. He covers how the press engages in propaganda and how some of those mechanisms work. New York Times here once again shamelessly engaging in said propaganda, playing stenographer for police departments and misframing the crime issue intentionally. It is journalistic malpractice, and it should be called out as such. Good on Alec for doing so. So I want to quickly plug my colleague, Eric Kessner. Regular viewers will know Eric as having been on the show quite a lot recently. We try to do a segment every week. Unfortunately, did not have a time to record this week, but I want to show you guys a video. Eric was recently involved in some actions pertaining to student debt cancellation. He was working with Afeni. Again, regular viewers of the show will know Afeni. She's an activist and organizer in DC who engages in mutual aid. She's also the campaign manager for Michaela Wilkes, who's a progressive running in Maryland. Afeni was at this event, so was Nina Turner and Cornel West. There were all sorts of great characters here in DC that were urging public officials to go forward with canceling student debt. So I want to show you Afeni's speech. This was filmed by Eric. This is on student debt in DC.
Well, hello, my name's Afeni. That's hard to follow. But I'm a core organizer of Freedom Fighters DC. I had the honor and the privilege to organize with the Debt Collective to bring this to life. I had also had the privilege of organizing with the Dream Defenders. They came up here to Canvas to do targeted outreach, so I'm really excited about that work. And I'm also the campaign manager for the Michaela Wilkes campaign. So I'm just going to keep it real short and sweet. Because, you know, so many people have said so many amazing things here today. But one thing I really want to say is that knowledge is not owned by anyone. It should not be bought and sold. It is not something that can be held from people justly. Knowledge is strength, it is empowerment, and we all deserve the self-determination that comes from being educated. The reason why we are here today is because we want to cancel all student debt and target the nucleus of this country's power, which is the financial power. This is just the first step. This is just the first step. Because we are radically thinking about what change looks like. We are radically thinking about what it looks like to have financial power in the hands of the people that actually create it. I did not get to finish college yet. I still haven't figured out what I want to do, y'all, but I have taken a couple of semesters and I have accrued some student loan debt that I'm not sure of the quantity of right now. But there are so many people like myself that never finish and that die with that debt. Straight like that. It is unfair and it is unjust because just because people want a better life for themselves, they want a better opportunity for themselves, especially as Black people, that we have to be punished by a debt that literally weighs us down and stops our upward mobility. Black women hold the most student loan debt out of any demographic group. And we also support 80% of the Black households in America, solely or mainly. So when we're talking about cancellation of student loan debt, we're talking about radically thinking about what it looks like to put financial power back into Black people's hands. That generational tax that goes from mother to daughter, mother to son, we want that gone. We want our children to be able to have the opportunity, maybe even if they don't want to go to college for something that's lucrative, like art or something like that, they should be able to live. We should not have to work to survive. So we're asking Joe Biden to pick up that pen, just like he picked up the pen and flicked it to sign the 90th on-four crime bill, just like he picked that pen up and flicked it for the Hyde Amendment, just like he picked it up and flicked it to mass incarcerate all the Black and brown people in this fucking country. Then that means he can pick up the goddamn pen and fucking cancel the student loan debt. So I want to finish off with a chant, because, you know, one of my favorite chants is hands up, and I don't say don't shoot, I say fight back. So, you know what I'm saying? When I say hands up, I need you to say fight back. You ready? Hands up, fight back! 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 Thank you guys so much.
Absolutely fantastic stuff there. Really want to give a huge shout out to both Afeni and the Debt Collective for helping to organize all of that, and a huge shout out, of course, to Eric for participating and getting the footage. And I wanted to point the audience in the description box, if you are on YouTube or on Facebook, in the description box is Eric's Twitter handle as well as his Patreon. If you are interested in contributing to Eric's activism in DC, you can go help him there. Make sure you're following him on Twitter. It's @VestActions on Twitter. He is doing all sorts of wonderful stuff out there in DC, and I could not be prouder to call him a friend and a colleague, and I encourage you all to support his work. Same with Afeni. She is @RedIsAri with 2 Ds in the red on Twitter. Make sure that you're following all of her fantastic work as well. Just wanted to give a shout out there to Eric. I hope that we'll have him back on next week for an interview to give us an update on what he's been up to in DC. So we have another less than pleasant story here about the climate. This one has to do with some climate scientists who have been arrested around the world. This is a Common Dreams piece. Dozens arrested as scientists worldwide mobilized to demand climate revolution. If everyone could see what I see coming, said one scientist, society would switch into climate emergency mode and end fossil fuels in just a few years. This is by Jake Johnson. More than 1,000 scientists across the globe chained themselves to the doors of oil-friendly banks, blocked bridges, and occupied the steps of government buildings on Wednesday to send an urgent message to the international community. The ecological crisis is accelerating, and only a climate revolution will be enough to avert catastrophe. What organizers described as the world's largest ever scientist-led civil disobedience campaign kicked off just days after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its latest report detailing the grim state of efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by century's end, a target set by the Paris Accord. As one of the report's authors put it during a press call earlier this week, unless there are immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, 1.5 degrees Celsius is beyond reach. Warning that the IPCC report's language was watered down at the behest of governments unwilling to rapidly phase out fossil fuels, scientists and their allies took that message further, adding their direct actions on Wednesday, operating under the slogan 1.5 degrees Celsius is dead, climate revolution now. I'm taking action because I feel desperate, said U.S. climate scientist Peter Kalmus, who along with several others locked himself to the front door of a J.P. Morgan Chase building in Los Angeles. A recent report found that the financial giant is the biggest private funder of oil and gas initiatives in the world. Quote, it's the 11th hour in terms of Earth breakdown, and I feel terrified for my kids and terrified for humanity, Kalmus continued. World leaders are still expanding the fossil fuel industry as fast as they can, but this is insane. The science clearly indicates that everything we hold dear is at risk, including even civilization itself and its wonderful, beautiful, cosmically precious life on this planet. I actually don't get how any scientist who understands this could possibly stay on the sidelines at this point. I apologize if you guys hear the train honking in the background. I live very close to train tracks. I apologize if that's distracting. So this is fantastic action, you guys. I also wanted to show you another headline here about how this might have been the last guy that they referenced at the JP Morgan in LA, but how the police responded to this. We covered earlier the cops. This is in Indy 100. 100 cops in riot gear showed up after 3 scientists handcuffed themselves to bank door. I wish I would have queued up some footage of that. One of my mutuals on Twitter was filming a lot of what was happening in LA. The cops showing up in riot gear for a few people handcuffed to a door at a bank. I mean, it's laughable. It's utterly laughable. Again, they are pathetic cowards, and they are clearly there to serve the powers that be. This reminds me a little bit of when they showed up to arrest Christian Smalls at the Amazon organizing event and said to him something to the effect of, "We've won, you lost." Making all too clear who they are actually there to protect and serve and who they are there to attack and oppress and arrest and brutalize, etc. So I want to commend these climate scientists for trying to keep this issue front and center. I think, this is it's like amazing to me that Don't Look Up got the kind of attention it got, and now we seem to have just turned the page again. David's whole point was like, this isn't just a story. This should be the story. And what has the media responded with? Basically nothing. Common Dreams does do a great job. I want to shout them out. They pretty consistently cover climate issues. So there is one outlet there that is covering this stuff. Obviously, David tries to keep it highlighted as well. But it's just astounding to me how such an urgent issue, even when the urgency is sort of like comedically pointed out through pop culture, can't seem to like take hold among our society. We can't seem to grasp the import of all of this and the urgency that we should be demonstrating. So good on Common Dreams and good on these climate scientists for trying to express that urgency and get people to react. We urgently need to move away from fossil fuels. We need to address the economic incentives that have led us to destroying the planet for profits. And we're nowhere close to any of that. This is another thing, you guys, where Joe Biden has reneged on innumerable promises as it pertains to the climate and trying to combat the climate crisis. Biden instead, approving dozens of new drilling permits. He tried to approve a massive drilling project in the Gulf of Mexico. Just all sorts of wrong-headed policy for someone who purports to understand the urgency of this and someone who said on the campaign that he would address this issue. We are over a year in, and he has done virtually nothing to do to address the climate crisis. So I want to show you guys here a clip of Matt Stoller. If you don't know Matt Stoller, he covers monopoly issues, antitrust issues, that kind of thing. And he did a clip for Breaking Points. He does a weekly collaboration with Breaking Points. I've also put in the description box. He's talking about a comment box that you can put into the government about monopoly and antitrust. He's going to go into that in this clip. Just want to tell the audience ahead of time. I linked that in the description box. You can scroll down there and find the link to leave your comment if you're interested in letting the federal government know what you think about monopoly power. And I also linked Matt's Substack below if you're interested in following his work. So this again is Matt Stoller on Breaking Points talking about antitrust enforcement.
Stoller, and this is another big breakdown. So what is the problem exactly with our economy, with our society? Well, there are many. Wages don't rise with profits. People are afraid of their boss. Medicine costs way too much and is full of really annoying and harmful bureaucracy. Corporations like Boeing can't even do the things that they are supposed to do, like build airplanes that don't crash. There's even mass censorship, which often we don't see. So, for instance, Sagar and Crystal have pointed out that YouTube sometimes downgrades breaking points videos, depending on the content. This is true for other firms like TikTok as well. Now, there's a thread connecting all or most of these problems: monopoly power. And monopoly power is undergirded by a specific technique used by Wall Street: mergers. Corporate mergers create monopolies. Now, over the last 40 years, waves of these corporate mergers have consolidated economic power into the hands of a small group of people that basically control all the money in the world and put you and me into automated phone trees whenever we need to get a hold of someone to help us. So let's talk about mergers. What is a merger? A corporate merger is what happens when two corporations combine into one corporation. Here's a clip from a slick video that was made by one of these corporations.
A merger occurs when two companies combine to create one organization. For example, Exxon and Mobil merged in 1999 to form a new company, ExxonMobil.
That's your friendly neighborhood giant multinational oil company recreating Standard Oil of the early 1900s. Now, there are some good reasons that corporations merge. Like, let's say you have an owner who wants to retire and sell his pool maintenance business or small software firm, or if a company's about to go bankrupt and needs a lifeline. It's really not a problem when this happens, when small firms merge. But when bigger ones buy one another, like when Exxon buys Mobil, it's very different. When big firms combine, the goal is often to corner a market and raise prices, or lower wages, or often both. Big firms that combine, when they merge, raise prices on average by 7%. And anyone who has tried to rent a car knows this, since Hertz and Dollar Thrifty merged in 2012 and immediately jacked up what it costs to rent a car. So higher prices, that's not all. Big corporations that merge usually lay people off. They reduce wages. They do more lobbying to corrupt politicians. And they pay their CEOs a lot of money. Now, you might remember that AT&T and Time Warner merger a few years ago. It was sort of a disaster for the two companies. There were big layoffs. AT&T, Time Warner, it's now splitting up. They fired a bunch of people and destroyed a lot of shareholder wealth. But the merger worked out for Time Warner CEO Jeff Bezos, who made $400 million with his golden parachute payoff when he sold Time Warner to AT&T. So that's an unsuccessful merger, and many mergers are unsuccessful, and they're a waste of time. They cause a lot of problems. But mergers that succeed are almost worse, because mergers, when they succeed, of big companies, more importantly than screwing things up, they create monopolies. They consolidate economic power. So for instance, Google, which is the company that sometimes censors this channel, has bought hundreds of firms since 2002, including, yes, YouTube. Facebook is another one that controls how we can communicate and think, bought Instagram and WhatsApp. Amazon, control over books, but also online commerce, has made hundreds of acquisitions to expand its business and wipe out potential competitors. It's not just big tech. The music events producer, just to pick one at random, Live Nation bought Ticketmaster over 10 years ago. And that's one reason ticket fees have been going up and up and up, and musicians and event producers routinely get bullied. There were 24 major airlines in 1980. Because of mergers, and there's some mergers listed on this chart, today there are basically 4 major airlines. The result is flight cancellations. There was a bunch of flight cancellations this weekend or last weekend on Southwest, but there have been hundreds of thousands over the course of the last few years. Ticket fees that we all love, poor service for those flying from big cities, and more importantly, the end of access to flights to and from most smaller and many mid-sized cities. A big chunk of the country just can't get access to the air grid anymore. Now, behind so many problems in our economy and in our society, you can find a merger or two or five. Take the 737 MAX. Yep, that is a result of Boeing merging with McDonnell Douglas. Drug and medical supply shortages? Yep, that's a result of mergers in an obscure space called group purchasing organizations. High ammunition prices? Yep, that's because a corporate raider bought and ruined Remington about 10 years ago. There are a lot of details in my newsletter on all of these case studies if you want to know more. I don't want to get too much into details on any particular one because that will get in the way of what I'm really trying to convey today. But you can look all of these up. They're really interesting. And the overall point here is that there are mergers that have consolidated everything from cheerleading to mail sorting software to prison phone services, pretty much every nook and cranny of our society. So for instance, in 2019, 2 large Nevada gold mines merged, and the merged entity ended up controlling 75% of Nevada gold production. And so what did this new firm do? Immediately it broke the union and reduced compensation because workers no longer had a choice of where to work. Okay, so mergers between big firms are almost always bad. So why do we allow them? And as it turns out, we didn't used to. And there's still a law against most of these big bad mergers. And it's called the Clayton Act. It was passed in 1914. It is, however, a law that for the last 40 years has largely gone unenforced. Why? There aren't that many actual conspiracies in politics, but this is a real one. In 1980, the incoming Reagan administration hatched a plot. They were trying to figure out how to get rid of antitrust law, how to release unfettered big business on the land. But they realized that repealing the law outright would be unpopular. So here's what they did instead. This is a memo that a researcher at my organization found in the Reagan Library. It's titled, "Throttling Back on Antitrust, a Practical Proposal for Deregulation." Now in it, George Stigler and Richard Posner, who were two famous antitrust thinkers, unveiled a plan to get rid of the Clayton Act without having to go to Congress. And remember, the Clayton Act is the law against these big bad mergers that have ruined a lot of the American economy. Now, the honest way to repeal a law is to make your case publicly, to go to Congress and get them to vote to repeal a law. And the Reagan administration, to be fair, did try that with the Clayton Act in 1986. But Congress refused to go along because people don't like big bad mergers. So instead, the Reagan administration effectively repealed the Clayton Act secretly. And here's how. There are instructions to courts and enforcers how the Antitrust Division thinks merger law should work. These are called merger guidelines. And judges basically trust enforcers and have trusted enforcers to tell them how to think about mergers and the Clayton Act. The law is a little bit vague, so these guidelines kind of fill in some of the blanks. The Reagan administration antitrusters took advantage of this, and they quietly rewrote merger laws. That's what that memo is about. Now, getting rid of the law without repealing it, but just not enforcing it, was an intentional strategy. Reagan's key antitrust enforcer was a guy named Bill Baxter. That's this guy. Baxter followed the secret plan and simply refused to enforce laws he didn't like. This included a bunch of the antitrust laws. He called, for instance, Supreme Court decisions that mandated strong antitrust rules, quote unquote, rubbish and wacko and idiocy. That's what he called one precedent. He just refused to follow the law. Now, the plan that Stigler and Posner outlined and that Baxter carried through worked. The antitrust laws basically went away without being repealed. Now, here's a chart. The formatting of this chart is very old-timey because it's an old chart from the 1980s, and it's on just what happened with corporate acquisitions after the new guidelines in 1982 kicked in. Now, on Wall Street in the 1980s, and then every decade since, it's been all about mergers and acquisitions, in which deal makers make millions selling companies to one another, and corporate raiders, who are now called private equity, make billions, often by buying companies, monopolizing markets, and laying off workers. Now, the culture on Wall Street and beyond basically became, in the 1980s, greed is good. In fact, one could argue that that was the motto of the 1980s. It was in a famous Oliver Stone 1987 movie called Wall Street. The thing is, greed is always with us. It's not like greed is new. What has changed wasn't human nature. We didn't become greedier. What changed was the law, and specifically the merger guidelines. Now, this legal change was so important that it literally rebuilt corporate America. Over the next 40 years, nearly every major firm was either acquired or it became an acquirer. And Bill Clinton, who is arguably the worst man alive, maybe in competition with Henry Kissinger for that title, actually made the problem worse. So did George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump. And thus, Boeing 737 MAX, Ticketmaster, airline fees, lower wages, and so on and so forth. But here's the thing, and this is where there's sort of some good news. The era of greed is good is ending. Both parties, increasingly, and the American people writ large, have had it. That's the good news. So let me introduce you to a new law enforcer named Lina Khan. Khan is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, which is the agency that is supposed to police fairness in our markets, including some parts of the Clayton Act. She's the youngest chair in history, and she is something of an ass kicker. Both Google and Amazon lobbied heavily against her nomination. They lost. She's a regular topic of conversation on CNBC, which is the news channel of Capital, because Khan wants to revive how we do antitrust, how the government, how our democracy relates to big business. So let's take a listen about how she thinks about big business and the law.
Historically, been various moments in which there's been a recognition across jurisdictions that if you allow unfettered monopoly power to concentrate, its power can rival that of the state, right? And historically, the antitrust laws have a rich tradition and rich history, and a key goal was to ensure that our commercial sphere was characterized by the same types of checks and balances and protections against concentration of economic power that we had set up in our political and governance sphere. And so the desire to kind of check those types of concentrations of power, I think, is deep in the American tradition.
So that's Lina Khan talking about how she thinks, that's her philosophy. And it's an old philosophy, but not a greed is good philosophy. Now, powerful firms like Google and Amazon also lobbied to prevent the other main antitrust enforcer in the Biden administration from being nominated. And his name is Jonathan Kanter. Less famous than Khan, he runs the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. But don't be fooled. Kanter is a longtime antitrust lawyer, but he is also bringing an aggressive new philosophy into the division. He has actually called for bringing back handcuffs, aka criminal charges, for executives who illegally monopolize. And that raised a lot of eyebrows. Now, Lina Khan and Jonathan Kanter are Democrats. They were picked by the Biden administration. But the right is also very angry about corporate power as well. Here's Laura Ingraham last week on Fox News talking about the social power and economic power of Disney and Apple.
The Antitrust Division at Justice needs to begin the process of considering which American companies need to be broken up once and for all, for competition's sake, and ultimately for the good of the consumers who pay the bills.
So you've got Khan and you've got Kanter, and they're Democrats, but they actually had around 67, 68 votes in the Senate, so a lot of Republicans voted for them. And then you have regular anti-monopoly arguments on Fox News. Now, of course, there are deep divides about social questions underpinning anti-monopolism on both sides. But both sides are increasingly realizing that dominant firms shouldn't be making key decisions over how society works, even if they disagree with each other about what they want those decisions to be. Now, Khan and Kanter have decided to take a playbook from Reagan and are rewriting the merger guidelines. But this time they're doing it in reverse. They want to enforce the law, not quietly repeal it. And here's where you come in. They want your help. Khan and Kanter have opened up a process for the government to solicit comments from the public on mergers. Essentially, they want you to email the government and say what you think. The reason this matters, the reason your comments matter, is because the new guidelines will be attacked in the courts. And judges are going to want to make sure that these merger guidelines are based on real input. And I've looked into the docket where there are a bunch of comments. There are a lot of nerdy and annoying economists and corrupt lobbyists who are organized, who are paid by dominant firms, and they have submitted their views saying, everything is going great, we don't need any changes. Khan and Kanter need to hear from ordinary people, like you and me. Here's Kanter a couple of months ago talking about the need for such feedback.
The views of consumers, workers, innovators, farmers, and others on the ground feeling the harms of market concentration present an incredibly valuable perspective for our efforts. And so here's our message to the entire American people. Please share your views. We need your input, and we absolutely care what you think.
You haven't seen any of this on the media, but this is what's actually going in the government. All the money and power in the world is being debated right now by these people with economists and lobbyists submitting comments in an obscure docket. And this is how politics actually changes. And I want to invite you in. So help out Khan and Kanter. If you have thoughts on mergers, if you've been through a merger, or if you've bought products from a company that merged, or if you just want to say no more power to big business, go ahead and do that. How? Well, I've put a link in the video description that you can use. The deadline is April 21st, and that's in about a week and a half. You can submit anonymously as well. So if you're worried about retaliation, just do it without your name attached. So use that link. There are instructions on how to do it. You can read as much as you want about it, but go ahead and get in there so that we can get a counterforce against the lobbyists. Now, a bunch of people have actually already submitted comments, from doctors to video gamers to pharmaceutical producers. The doctors' ones are amazing, talking about private equity coming in and reducing wages and causing them to harm their patients. Really amazing. The video gamers are concerned about Microsoft Activision. But, come in, chime in on whatever you're concerned about. Now, on one of the links below, you can also look at the docket like I have and read the comments that other people have put in there. Now, what Khan and Kanter are asking for, what I'm asking you to do, may not seem like a big deal. You might think that your voice just doesn't matter. But here's the thing, in this case, it does. There are a bunch of comments, but only 300 right now in the docket. So that's not very many. And having one more or two more does actually matter. Your voice really can make a difference. It's a really bad time right now. It feels very divided. The media is constantly talking about doom, doom, doom. But if you look at antitrust, corporate power questions, we really are making progress. And it's not covered by the media. These kinds of obscure procedural issues that involve all the money and power in the world, you don't see them on Fox News or MSNBC. You see them on Breaking Points, but not in the mainstream media. But we are making progress. 2.5 years ago, antitrust was just kind of an interesting idea. But today, there are 5 different government antitrust suits just against Google, and many more that are going to be filed against a lot of dominant firms. So I'm asking you to submit a comment because it will have an impact. Let's reverse what our leaders have done to this country and free ourselves from the monopolies ruining our society. Thanks for watching this big breakdown on the Breaking Points channel. If you'd like to know more about big business and how our economy really works, you could sign up below for my market power focused newsletter, Big.
So first of all, I just can't gloss over the little comment he made in the middle there about Bill Clinton might be the worst person in the world or Henry Kissinger's in the running there, right? I thought that was fucking hilarious. That's absolutely hilarious. Yeah, Bill Clinton, by the way, one of the reasons that's quite true. I mean, maybe not literally, but he's a very bad dude, is because he basically ensured that the Reaganistic view of economics became universal. He's the one that more than anybody else pulled the Democrats into the neoliberal sphere. So he kind of eliminated any institutional competition or opposition to Reagan's neoliberal trickle down nonsense. And I just love that little quip from Matt there right in the middle of his report. He might be the worst person in the world, or maybe Henry Kissinger. That's hilarious. If you're cynical like me, borderline cynical, however you want to phrase it, you may kind of scoff at the end point where he's saying, please go leave a comment, okay? I just want to make a case really quick to encourage you all to leave a quick comment, even if it's just as quick as, monopoly bad, please fix. I don't care. The reason that it actually matters in this case, if you have a story to tell, please tell it. The reason it actually matters in this case is because it's about legal proceedings. So this isn't like a leave a comment to convince your representative to do the right thing kind of an issue. This is leave a comment because we need stories to present to the judges to go forward with this proceeding. Okay. So it is a little bit different than just like asking a powerful person to do the right thing. I know that can feel entirely futile and like a waste of your time. This is a little bit different than that. So again, I put that link in the description box there if any of you are interested in leaving a comment for the antitrust lawyers who are trying to push forward with this. And huge shout out to Matt. I also linked his Substack big in the description box there. He does really great work, you guys, detailing how these monopolies form and develop and how they maintain their power and how they affect everyday people. So just wonderful stuff from Matt. Encourage you all to follow his work as well. And object to monopolies, you guys. This is really, really, really simple. It's never good for workers or consumers. It's never good for everyday people when you have a large portion of a market consolidated to one or a few companies. It's never good. It's just all bad. So we're going to talk a little bit here about the anti-trans legislation in Alabama. This is in Truthout. And just for context, you guys, this kind of bill, other similar types of bills are happening in any number of states across the country. Obviously, the Florida Don't Say Gay bill has gotten quite a bit of attention. We previously covered Artemis's piece on Real Progressives about the Utah legislation. Texas had passed legislation weeks ago that was similar to this. So this is a wider phenomenon than Alabama, but this is a specific example here in Truthout. Alabama GOP anti-trans restroom bill also muzzles education on LGBTQ issues. And just really quickly before we dive into this, you guys, the notion that forcing kids to use the wrong bathroom, which is basically what these conservatives want to do, is a safety thing, is ridiculous, because trans children are far more likely to be assaulted if they're forced to use the wrong bathroom. So you're creating more violence by implementing this policy that you're implementing under the guise of safety for children. Okay. Trans kids are much more likely to be harassed or assaulted if you force them to use the bathroom of the gender they don't identify with. So this is a bill that would inflict direct harassment and violence towards the trans community, and yet it's being proposed under the justification that it would help to solve violence against kids. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ass backwards. The Alabama state legislature passed a measure on Thursday that would ban transgender students in public schools from using restrooms that correspond to their gender identities. If the bill is signed into law by the state's Republican governor, it would also restrict teachers from discussing sexual orientation or gender in K-5 classrooms. The bill originally only included restroom restrictions for transgender youth. Republican lawmakers who sponsored and supported the discriminatory bill did so under the guise of protecting children, specifically young girls. However, numerous studies have shown that there are no dangers at all when it comes to allowing transgender students to use restrooms that correspond to their gender identities. In fact, the opposite is true. Restrictive bathroom bills actually endanger trans students, as transgender children face higher rates of harassment, sexual assault, and violence when they are forced to use the incorrect restrooms. The American Civil Liberties Union of Alabama condemned the legislation, describing it as being discriminatory and in violation of the United States Constitution and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. Quote, this legislation is part of a systemic and growing attack on trans people, particularly trans youth, in all aspects of life, the organization said in a statement. Democratic lawmakers lambasted the Republican-sponsored legislation as being cruel to trans students. Quote, we're turning into bullies to these kids, and it's not a good feeling, said Rep. Napoleon Bracey, a Democrat. As the bill was being debated, lawmakers added another amendment at the last minute, a rider that would ban teachers in K-5 classrooms from discussing issues related to sexuality or gender identity, similar to the Don't Say Gay legislation that was recently signed into law in the neighboring state of Florida. Sally Smith, executive director of the Alabama Association of School Boards, said that the amendment wasn't necessary as such topics aren't brought up in those grades to begin with. But the amendment would still be harmful to LGBTQ kids, she added, as it could make it even more difficult for school faculty to create safe environments for some students and families. The bill now goes to Governor Kate Ivey's desk for consideration based on recent political ads from her campaign that target trans kids in the state. There's a high likelihood that she will sign the bill into law. So continuing attacks on the trans community in Alabama. They join a number of other states that are implementing similar bills about, youth sports or about which bathrooms and locker rooms you can use. And Alabama taking it to the extent that they also joining Florida in a way, in taking it to the point where they don't even want these issues being mentioned, which is, there's so many angles you can take to this, right? The Republican hypocrisy of calling everybody a snowflake, and then they get all offended and butthurt about someone else's gender identity, for fuck's sake. There's the constantly playing victim and feeling threatened while you accuse the left of being cowardly. Like, there's so many hypocrisies here that you could go down. And obviously, like, it's also a continuation of an admission that their arguments do not win, right? Look at how they treat critical race theory. Look at how they treat discussing gender issues or sexuality issues in a classroom. They are so thoroughly terrified of these arguments that they just have to ban them. They don't think they're going to win those arguments. So they just say, no, we can't even, no, just stop talking about it. Don't allow kids to even hear it. That's a whole nother angle to this. So obviously the core point is that the trans community is being, having violence inflicted upon them by the state in a number of different states and local constituencies, and we need to fight back against that as robustly as we possibly can. This is violence being inflicted upon the trans youth in Alabama, in Utah, in Texas, in Florida, and elsewhere. So, good on Truth out there for covering that. And we'll try to keep up on that story going forward. I also want to encourage everybody to go to realprogressives.org, and you hit the media tab at the top. It drops down. You can hit articles, and you can find our piece on that from Artemis, who wrote a piece maybe a month ago or 2 months ago on the bills that were up in Utah that were along a similar line. So really encourage everybody to educate yourself on that issue, and we'll keep covering that as the story develops. We're going to get into our labor update this week, you guys. This is one of the few topics that excites me and inspires me and brings me a little bit of hope. We have some clips from More Perfect Union, as always, and I also have a couple of articles and a tweet thread here to show you. We're going to start with this Alex Thompson thread. So this is about Jeff Stein here reporting Biden talking. I'm sure a number of you saw this clip. Biden talking to union workers today. Amazon, here we come. Watch. Cites his admin push for the PRO Act. Now, first of all, his admin has not pushed for the PRO Act. They've rhetorically said they support the PRO Act. Those are very, very different things. They could have passed the PRO Act if they wanted to use the bully pulpit at all, and they have refused. So let's dispel with that notion that Biden is somehow fighting for workers here. No, he's rhetorically saying he sides with workers for the political benefit while refusing to lift a finger to do a goddamn thing. Alex Thompson here retweets Jeff Stein and says, also notable given that Biden's former communications director, Jay Carney, is Amazon's senior VP for policy and press. Real coincidence there, right? reminds me of this good Wall Street Journal story. Mr. Carney has sent a series of frustrated messages to White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain about perceived slights against Amazon, said people familiar with the messages. And some of you will note that after Biden said his look out Amazon or something, watch out Amazon, whatever it was he said, I think it was the following day, Jen Psaki was asked about this. What his position is, asked about the comment Biden had made. And Psaki kind of walked it back. She basically said, well, the state's not going to do anything to help the workers. Biden just theoretically supports the workers' right to organize, right? So they walk it back, and you have to wonder if there's some connection there to Jay Carney having been Biden's former communications director and now being a senior VP for Amazon. So hilarious that it was reported too that Carney was sending messages expressing his disappointment with Biden's very tepid criticisms of Amazon. That is just hilarious. You hardly have to say, if you're not in full-throated support of Amazon, then it's not enough. You know what I mean? Because Biden hasn't come out and he hasn't come out strongly in opposition to Amazon's treatment of workers or their union busting or any of it. He said once, watch out Amazon or something like that. I don't know. That they take that as harshly as they do is kind of indicative of how comfortable they are and how used to having the support of all of these powerful institutions they are, how entitled to that support they feel. So anyway, great point there from Alex Thompson that Jay Carney is connected to the Biden administration. I also have a piece I want to show you guys here in The Lever. This is by Matthew Cunningham Cook and Walker Bregman. Biden offers Amazon workers rhetoric, but no action. The president lauded a union drive and declared Amazon, here we come, but he's refused to even follow his own task force's limited recommendations to boost unionization. On Wednesday, President Joe Biden made headlines pledging to support Amazon workers trying to unionize the nation's largest retailer, declaring Amazon, here we come, and boasting that I created the White House Task Force on Worker Organization and Empowerment to make sure that the choice to win a union belongs to workers alone. But as campaign cash from Amazon-linked donors and anti-union law firms has flooded into the coffers of Biden and his Democratic Party, the president has so far refused to use his executive authority to actually implement any of that task force's major recommendations, even though its proposals were far weaker than his 2020 campaign pledges and likely wouldn't have helped Amazon workers' union drive. What might have helped are executive actions Biden continues to avoid. For instance, he has refused to reinstate an Obama-era rule requiring companies like Amazon to disclose all of their spending to crush union drives. Such disclosures can help union organizers combat the anti-labor tactics of major law firms, like those that previously employed the husband of the task force's chair, Vice President Kamala Harris. Biden has also declined to use his executive authority to halt federal contracts to Amazon amid its union busting campaign. In fact, Amazon was awarded a $10 billion contract last summer, months after the president promised on the campaign trail to ensure federal contracts only go to employers who sign neutrality agreements committing not to run anti-union campaigns. It's clear there are a lot of these tensions inside the Democratic Party, said John Logan, a professor of labor and employment studies at San Francisco State University. On the one hand, you have a president who says he wants to be the most pro-union president in history. On the other, you can only judge him on his accomplishments in office. We're not going to get the PRO Act, not going to get labor provisions and Build Back Better. What are we going to get? So this Biden, again, talking the talk and not walking the walk. How many promises has he reneged on in just over a year? It's to those who wanted to say, I remember the commentary when Biden, first responded to COVID, maybe a few months into his presidency or something. There were all these people who wanted to say, oh, he's the modern FDR, most progressive president ever. And it's just so utterly laughable. It's like I almost don't know how to respond to somebody who says that with a straight face. How can you have been so successfully propagandized, such that you believe that someone who, by the way, under his tenure thus far, has overseen cuts to the NLRB and their resources? Someone who has refused to use his executive authority to fight on behalf of workers and unions and labor organizers. Someone who continues to take money from these gigantic corporations and banks and from the firms that engage in union busting. I mean, it's so laughable on the surface, and yet people will say it with a straight face. Biden's the most progressive president ever. He's a modern FDR. Give me a break. That is just the labor issue that I talked about. Do you want to talk about healthcare? Do you want to talk about education? Do you want to talk foreign policy? Do you want to talk housing, right? Do you want to talk environmental issues? Any of it? Do you want to talk criminal justice reform or policing? Where has he been progressive? I mean, I'm sorry. Give me a fucking break. The tepidly progressive things that he did were undone. The child tax credit only lasted a year. He gave us $1,400 instead of $2,000 and then stopped it. The unemployment assistance, the additional unemployment assistance for those who were out of work during COVID. What did he do? He intentionally undid it, forcing people back to work in the middle of a fucking pandemic with no raise, no compensation increases, no better workplace treatment, no addressing the overworked populace of service workers and retail workers and people that were on the front lines, who he has no problem calling heroes, but he does nothing to improve their lives whatsoever. And people still call him FDR and the most progressive president ever. It is literally laughable. Absolutely laughable. Great reporting there from The Lever. As always, encourage you all to follow their work. David Sirota and his colleagues, fantastic stuff. One of the few outlets that I think does consistently excellent work in today's unfortunate media environments. One other outlet that I think does consistently fantastic work is More Perfect Union, and we have a piece here about Howard Schultz and his awful, disastrous, humiliating, embarrassing start to his second tenure with Starbucks. This again, More Perfect Union, you guys, it's perfectunion.us is their website, at More Perfect US on Twitter. Encourage you all to follow their work. Starbucks barista challenges CEO Howard Schultz at airport meeting. Quote, "If you hate Starbucks so much, why don't you go somewhere else?" Schultz told a barista who challenged his anti-union stance. And you guys, the first thing I thought about when I heard this was, doesn't that remind you of when Biden would be challenged on the campaign trail and he'd be like, well, you should just vote for Trump then. If I'm not good enough, you should just vote for Trump. I mean, he literally pulled the, I don't fucking care what you think, go somewhere else, right? Meanwhile, Starbucks wants to portray themselves as a progressive company. They want to call their baristas, their workers, they want to call them partners while they treat them like that. Oh, you don't like it? Fuck off and go elsewhere. Is that how you treat a partner? It's insane. Absolutely insane. This is by Jordan Zakarin. Tensions flared during a meeting between Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz and workers in Long Beach, California on Friday, closing out a tumultuous first week for the returning executive. Madison Hall, a 25-year-old barista and union organizer, says that the 68-year-old billionaire repeatedly bristled at and cut off their questions about Starbucks' handling of the growing union movement within the company. Quote, "If you hate Starbucks so much, why don't you go somewhere else?" Schultz told Hall. They recalled. Hall, who has been leading the unionization effort at the Second and Covina store in Long Beach, was offered a last-minute invitation to the gathering by their manager on Thursday evening. The event took place in a conference room in a building near the Long Beach airport and was pitched to them as an opportunity to meet the senior-level management with little other context. There were about 20 workers from various stores in the Long Beach area in attendance, along with management-level Starbucks employees. The event began with a full replay of the hour-long speech that Schultz gave to the entire company via live stream on Monday. The CEO attacked Starbucks workers united several times throughout the speech, calling them outsiders trying to take our people and part of a nationwide assault on corporations. We previously covered that clip, and it's incredible that he just so openly admits our people. He thinks he owns his employees. Notice the accidental admissions in the way that he phrases things. Schultz then arrived to participate in a moderated 2-hour session that included several activities and a Q&A with workers. Some baristas were in awe of Schultz. Others were more skeptical, Hall says. According to a statement given to More Perfect Union by a Starbucks spokesperson, the focus of the meeting was about ways we can improve the partner experience and the various ways we can co-create the future of Starbucks together. Similar meetings took place in Seattle and Chicago last week. During one activity, workers were asked to answer several prompts by writing answers on sticky notes and placing them on the whiteboard with the corresponding question. In response to a question asking how Starbucks could rebuild trust between management and workers, Hall says that they posted a note that said, "Sign the fair election principles and be honest and transparent about what's happening to pro-union workers around the country." Several other workers added stickers to denote agreement with the sentiment, but when Hall tried to bring it up during a group discussion about honesty and transparency, Schultz refused to comment. "You are constantly telling us that you are not anti-union. You're constantly saying that you respect our right to unionize," Hall says they told Schultz. "We're not going to talk about that," Schultz replied. So I want to reread the last part of this particular sentence because it's like they contradict themselves in like 2 seconds. But when Hall tried to bring it up during a group discussion about honesty and transparency, Shultz refused to comment. You see how they want to just use words in this totally hollow and meaningless and vacuous way? They just want to throw out nice sounding things that they have no intention of backing up with their actions. And then when they're pressed on it during a discussion about honesty and transparency, he says, no, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about my fake support for your right to unionize. Unreal. Very bad, disastrous, embarrassing, counterproductive first meeting for Howard Schultz in his second stint as CEO of Starbucks. And it's, you'll love to see it. I was talking earlier about the schadenfreude I get over CNN's, failures. I get a similar feeling watching Howard Schultz stumble his way through his first couple of appearances as Starbucks CEO. We now have a more perfect union clip for you guys. This is also about Starbucks and some of the specific tactics that they have used, illegal tactics, I might add, that they have used to try to bust these unionization efforts. This is More Perfect Union. Once again, guys, at More Perfect US on Twitter. Really encourage you to follow their work.
The biggest labor story in America right now isn't getting the attention it deserves. Starbucks, America's biggest coffee chain, is engaged in illegal activities on a scale that has never been witnessed in recent history. We've searched through previously unreported documents, uncovered new evidence, and found information that should establish the basis for a new major lawsuit against Starbucks by the Biden administration. In the last few months, there have been at least 63 different allegations made by employees of Starbucks, which contend the company has engaged in illegal activity against them. These unfair labor practice charges, which have been filed with the National Labor Relations Board, span across the entire country, from Buffalo to Seattle and everywhere in between. Phoenix, Memphis, Austin, Denver, Peoria, Knoxville, Kansas City, Jacksonville, Santa Cruz, and many more. The pace and velocity of these charges against Starbucks is increasing. More than half of the total NLRB filings on Starbucks' illegal activities have come in the last month alone. We combed through these documents. Again and again, the charges made by Starbucks employees are the same. Violations alleged of Section 8 of the National Labor Relations Act, which asserts that an employer may not interfere with, restrain, or coerce employees. For months, More Perfect Union has revealed stories of Starbucks executives pummeling their workers with baseless fears and propaganda to smear unions. What Starbucks Workers United called a blatant shock and awe campaign, intended to psychologically punish prospective pro-union workers. Starbucks subjected workers to captive audience meetings and threatened to close stores, and the company even fired a popular manager because she questioned the company's tactics. Starbucks workers say the company is intentionally spying on their union gatherings, questioning employees about union activities. Workers are being threatened with job loss, warned that they'll be discharged or retaliated against if they side with the union. And recently, more and more organizing employees are stating that they have in fact been outright fired as a result of their pro-union activities. These brave Starbucks workers have not broken laws or tried to maliciously damage the company. No, their crime, in the company's eyes, is engaging in their constitutional right to organize. And they are organizing because they believe Starbucks can have a stronger business, one that retains its workers with good pay and benefits, offers opportunities for professional growth, all while maintaining a better and safer workplace. But Starbucks doesn't want to cede any power to workers, so it is increasingly retaliating in ways that they are trying to hide from the public eye. Growing more desperate as the union campaign has spread to over 150 Starbucks stores across 27 states, Starbucks has pivoted its strategy in recent weeks. They've replaced their CEO Kevin Johnson and brought back their former CEO Howard Schultz, who has a history of union busting, including widely condemned comments made during a mandatory meeting with workers in Buffalo last fall. The coffee giant is worried. Given that very few of its strategies have stopped the union movement so far, Starbucks has moved to the phase of straight-up illegality. Here's the proof. It began on January 25th. 2 Buffalo Starbucks locations had already voted to form a union. Another in Mesa, Arizona was in the process, and the workers were gaining steam within the company and in the press. On this Tuesday afternoon, a Starbucks district manager tried to intimidate 19-year-old Layla Dalton, a Phoenix employee, into quitting. The manager said she was suspending Layla and shutting down the store for the day. Her violation? Layla had texted her direct supervisor. According to an NLRB investigation, the manager began enforcing a previously unenforced rule prohibiting employees from communicating with supervisors by text message. Layla had texted her boss at least 12 times before this incident without any problems, but suddenly she was being suspended for it. Was Layla texting something inappropriate to her boss? No, she was communicating about the levels of staffing in the store. Just a few days before targeting Layla, Starbucks set its sights on another employee in the Phoenix store, Alyssa Sanchez. Sanchez was forced to quit because the company cut her hours. The NLRB determined this action was taken because Alyssa was supportive of the union and an ally of Layla's. A little over a month later, in March, More Perfect Union published Layla's recorded footage of the conversation she had with her supervisor back in late January. We spoke with one of her coworkers, Sophia Lugo, who defended Layla's work ethic. Lugo had her hours drastically reduced and was forced to quit the store. 3 Starbucks employees, 1 store in Phoenix, all targeted by upper management for union activity. This is part of an emerging company-wide pattern of union busting. A couple of weeks after Layla's encounter with Starbucks management in Phoenix, another disturbing incident occurred. On February 8th, 7 employees at a Memphis location were fired for purportedly letting unauthorized non-employees, media, in a few minutes after closing. A former Starbucks manager in that store told More Perfect Union that the reasons for the firing were specious and that it's definitely union busting. By mid-February, More Perfect Union was contacted by multiple union organizers who said they were being targeted by a new policy of reducing the work hours of union organizers. We reported that the company was trying to reduce the hours of these staffers to lay the foundation for subsequently terminating part-time employees after additional full-time hires were made. And within days, it happened just as we predicted. On February 20th, another illegal firing occurred. This time it was in Buffalo. Cassie Fleischer, a well-respected employee who had been at the company for 5 years, was suddenly terminated when she was told by a manager that the company would no longer be flexible with her work hours. In a Facebook post, Cassie wrote, "This is not the company I signed on to, and it just further proves we need a union in our stores." First in Phoenix, then in Memphis, and then Buffalo. By late February, when a Starbucks store in Mesa voted overwhelmingly to unionize, the campaign began to gather a lot of national attention. But less noticed and appreciated was that Starbucks corporate management was trying to systematically eliminate this perceived threat to the company. On March 3rd, Starbucks struck again. Danny Rojas, a Buffalo employee who had been with the company for 3.5 years, was fired. Rojas had worked a night shift at Trader Joe's and didn't want to be a half hour late to work, as they had been a few days earlier. Starbucks had forced them to take the morning shift if they wanted to keep their job, so they slept in their car just to be able to open the store at 5:30 a.m. It didn't matter. The company fired them that day. "This wouldn't be happening if I wasn't part of their organizing committee," Rojas told their supervisor. By March, Starbucks Workers United was witnessing instances all over the country that made clear what was truly going on. The company was at war with its own pro-union workforce. On March 14th, SB Workers United filed charges with the NLRB, stating, "These hours cuts are in swift response to workplace organizing campaigns at Starbucks stores around the country." The complaint says that the reductions have happened in at least 20 states, including Maryland, Florida, New York, Ohio, Colorado, California, and Texas. The reduction of hours has resulted in lost pay, has rendered or will soon render employees ineligible for benefits that have hours worked eligibility requirements, including healthcare coverage and the Starbucks College Achievement Plan, tuition coverage, and has or will soon result in the constructive discharge of Starbucks employees, the union complaint asserts. Sarah Pappen, a shift supervisor in Seattle, told us, "In the 8 years I've worked for Starbucks, I've never seen the company slash hours this severely or this widely. I've never seen us cut hours like this in March when our business is already ramping up for the season. Workers know what's going on. The only question is whether the company will get away with it." Labor law in America is weak and has been further undermined by a persistent corporate attack over decades. But the current NLRB General Counsel, Jennifer Abruzzo, has vowed to use whatever authorities she has to go to bat for organizing workers. For years, corporations like Starbucks have assumed they can get away with their union-busting conduct with a simple slap on the wrist or a minor penalty well after they engage in the illegal conduct. Without much fanfare, Abruzzo last month issued a new initiative to change that dynamic. She vowed to take union-busting employers to court immediately. We talked to Abruzzo, and she explained her new initiative.
For me, if If employers are engaging in conduct to truly nip in the bud an organizing effort and to squelch worker voice, I feel that the agency should be mandated to go into district court to get the employer to stop doing that.
Abruzzo laid out her fears that companies like Starbucks are banking on enforcers to be lax and challenging these illegal firings.
If we wait until the board decides the case, it'll be 3 years from now, and that's too late. And we need the action to take place right now.
If Abruzzo gets her way, Starbucks' next stop might be facing off against the United States government in a federal district court.
We would be mandated to go in and, stop the employer in its tracks when it comes to interfering with, employees wanting a union in their workplace.
So hardly surprising, but very relevant and important things to cover, right? We've seen how corporations respond to labor organizing across the country. They feel entirely emboldened to break the law. They feel entitled to have a workforce that is not unionized. It's really just an overwhelming hurdle that we have to get over, and that we are currently in the way, or in the process of trying to jump over. And that's why I'm so inspired by this labor push, you guys, is because it is such a David Goliath thing. And these Starbucks workers, the Amazon workers, all of the strikes that we have covered for the last year or so, it's just heartwarming to see. And I stand in full solidarity with those workers who are organizing. And I just want to underscore the point there about like some of the tactics they use in terms of scheduling with employees. They know if they can force organizers out because they're not giving them enough hours, if they force those organizers to quit, and then they're replaced by a new worker, there's a decent chance that new worker is not going to be as active with the union, or might not support the union, might not vote, might not be interested. The company knows that the more organizers they can force out and replace with a question mark, the better their odds are, right? So what they'll do is they'll start cutting full-time workers' hours down, such that they may struggle to pay their bills. And then when those employees leave, they benefit from the replacement being often not as pro-union or not as active in organizing or whatever it might be, right? We talked with Len Harris, who's organizing her store in Colorado, and she said similar conduct was done there, that the scheduling was clearly done in very convenient ways for management to try to kind of force people out. And then it was also then used, like when employees said, well, listen, I need more hours or I'm going to have to go take a second job. Then that was like used against them. They manipulate everything in the most convenient way for management and for the company, with schedules and all that kind of stuff. And, as they said there at the end in the More Perfect Union clip, just brazenly illegal conduct here on behalf of Starbucks. Unsurprising, but, I'm thrilled to see how futile their efforts seem to have been. They are getting absolutely railroaded by these organizers all across the country, and you just have to love to see it, right? So anyway, we'll keep up on the Starbucks story. Obviously, it's a huge one. We'll keep up on the Amazon story. It's a huge one. And I have one more clip here from More Perfect Union to show you guys. This is actually about congressional staffers who are organizing for a union in response to what they describe as an abusive culture, an abusive environment that they work in there on Capitol Hill.
Have folks advocating for better nutrition assistance and better pay, better wages, at the same time as their own staff being forced to live on food stamps.
We don't usually hear much from congressional staffers because they do so much of their work out of public view, but that seems to be changing.
Congressional staffers are severely underpaid and overworked at starting salaries between like $30,000 and $40,000 in one of the nation's most expensive cities.
To be honest, I wouldn't have been able to take this job had my dad not passed away when I was 20 years old. He had a life insurance plan out for me, and I had a small chunk of savings that allowed me to come to the Hill and really survive my first 2 years.
I made $30,000, lived in a giant group house, but I had to work
a second job at a restaurant. I felt like I was running myself ragged and really living paycheck to paycheck. Going to the doctor was out of the question. Going to therapy was out of the question.
Many people have tons of horror stories. People are physically abused, mentally abused, to some very severe points of depression and much worse.
And weeks where you were working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I've been on the Hill for 2 years. I haven't taken more than a day or two off at a time.
I was one of only 2 people of color in an office, a staff of 16 people. That office was not an exception to the rule, but was the rule. So when we tackle issues like criminal justice, issues that affect specific communities, and then you realize that no one from those communities is actually in the room where the decisions are being made, that's a big issue.
And what you're seeing as a result of, the horrible work conditions, from culture of sexual harassment to horrible unlivable wages to 60 plus 70-hour work week, you're seeing a brain drain from Congress to powerful special interests who seek to influence it. And that makes it harder for our bosses to legislate in ways that reflect the best interest of their constituents.
Having a union to benefit the workplace and give people a voice on the job is probably one of the most effective ways to actually help Congress help the American people.
Back in 1995, Congress passed the Congressional Accountability Act, and in 1996 it was implemented. And this was supposed to allow workers on Capitol Hill to be able to form unions and bargain collectively. But at that time, Congress applied it to sort of everybody except the people who work directly with us. For 26 years, Congress failed to apply the freedom to form a union and bargain collectively to our own employees, the people who work in our district offices, in our DC offices, and on our committees.
Sign it here. Michigan Democratic Congressman Andy Levin introduced a resolution today that would allow House staffers to form a union.
Congressional staff workers are one step closer to forming a union.
I feel like the momentum is incredible, and it's all due to these workers and their movement.
In the Senate, Senator Sherrod Brown is planning to introduce a resolution to allow Senate staff to unionize. Congressional unions are vocally supported by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and President Joe Biden. Some of the nation's largest unions have come out in support.
Employers often say, oh, I support workers' rights to have a union, but when it comes to their own workers, all of a sudden they get cold feet. And we here in Congress really need to walk the walk.
As the resolution came out, one of the things we started hearing from a lot of senior staff and even some members behind closed doors is, either feigned confusion of we're not sure what a union could look like on the Hill because the Hill is so different.
Union elections for congressional staff would be run the very same way union elections have been run for every other employee in America for nearly a century.
Our bosses ran on a labor platform promising to give and protect every worker's right to organize. Every Democrat but one voted to pass the PRO Act. At the same time, the staffers who actually wrote that bill don't have that own right in their own workplaces.
And all we're asking for is for them to apply those same values to the halls of Congress.
You're seeing workers organize at Starbucks, at Amazon, digital media workers all across the country organizing and bargaining for a better life, and I feel like our own employees deserve the same rights that everybody else does.
The Congressional Workers Union is here. We're going to keep organizing, and we're going to win.
So just another, it's just amazing to me how widespread this movement is, how it is across regions and across industries, that workers are finally sort of standing up for themselves and wielding the power that they have as the many for the first time in what, half a century, if not more, that we're actually seeing a real wave like this have some success. I'm just thrilled to see it, you guys. I do want to say there was a key word there when they were talking about the political leaders who support unions. They said vocally supported by Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden. I think that it's worth noting that they have done nothing of substance to support this or any other unionization efforts. They have not used their bully pulpit of sorts to force the PRO Act through. Biden has not used his executive pen to do anything to support workers. He's allowed the NLRB to see their funding gutted under his leadership. And I think it's worth noting that the vocally is a very important word in that sentence. I do not trust any of those three to sincerely support or fight for or put any political leverage towards pushing for workers or for labor organizers. So I hope I'm wrong. I really sincerely do. I want congressional staffers and all other workers to have a fair fight if they would like to unionize their workplace. But More Perfect Union there again with the fantastic reporting at More Perfect US on Twitter. Really encourage you all to follow their work, and we'll keep up on all of these unionization and strike efforts and walkouts and protests and all of this stuff that the labor movement is producing at the moment. It is one of my favorite things to cover every single week. We have a story about Yemen to get into here, you guys. There has been a temporary ceasefire announced and agreed to. This is in Al Jazeera. Head of new Yemeni council promises end to war. Rashad al-Alimi, who has close ties to Saudi Arabia, says the council will deal with challenges in all areas of Yemen without discrimination, without exception. Now, there is some concern because of al-Alimi's ties to Saudi Arabia here, but there is a ceasefire in place. That's a step, right? The head of Yemen's new presidential council said he would end the 7-year-long war via a peace process in his first speech since power was delegated to the body by the Saudi-backed president this week. Quote, the Leadership Council promises the people to end the war and achieve peace through a comprehensive peace process that guarantees the Yemeni people all its aspirations, Rashad al-Alimi said in a televised speech on Friday. President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, I apologize, you guys, if I'm butchering any of these names, who is based in Riyadh, delegated power to the council and dismissed his deputy on Thursday as Saudi Arabia moved to strengthen an anti-Houthi rebel alliance amid UN-led efforts to revive peace negotiations. Al-Alimi, who has close ties with both Riyadh and the prominent Yemeni bloc, the Islah Party, said in his speech the council would work to deal with challenges in all areas of Yemen without discrimination, without exception. The war has killed tens of thousands. That's probably a very conservative estimate, by the way, devastated the economy and pushed Yemen to the brink of famine. The conflict is widely seen as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Iran-aligned Houthis say they are fighting a corrupt system and foreign aggression. And I quickly want to address that figure, you guys. That may be the figure for people actually killed by like airstrikes or by direct acts of war. But I've seen the figure 377,000 people, including 50,000 children, when you include those who have died because of the illegal blockade on behalf of the United States and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and all of our allies. This has long been, I hesitate to really use the term civil war or war or conflict, because what this really has been is more closely or more accurately described as a genocide or an attempted genocide. The coalition that has supported Saudi Arabia and the UAE includes the United States, Canada, many of our NATO allies, France, UK, etc. And that is what has allowed the coalition to be so devastating in their barbarity against the Houthi rebels and the civilians in Yemen. The blockades also obviously devastating. A lot of talk lately about sanctions because of the Russia-Ukraine situation. This is one example of what our sanctions actually do. It disallows people from meeting their basic needs, from having access to medical technology or medicine, etc. And you see kids and civilians end up starving and dying of thirst and dying of lack of basic resources, etc. It's outrageous. It's disgusting. I am glad to see that a ceasefire is in place. I am, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit hesitant to believe that this will solve the problem, because the person in charge of the group that is now in charge of the country is closely tied to Saudi Arabia, which gives me some reasons to hesitate about the new power setup. But The ceasefire will last 2 months, according to the reports that I read, and that is at least 2 months where Yemeni civilians theoretically do not have to deal with being shelled and dealing with airstrikes and direct acts of war. So that is at least a potential positive step. That is, maybe a tiny step towards finding peace in the region, and that is good news for once as it pertains to Yemen. I want to again point out, you guys, that we all hear so much about the Ukraine and about Russia, and we hear so little about all of these other instances around the world, like Yemen, like Syria, like Iraq, like Saudi Arabia, like Somalia, like Sudan, like Palestine, all of these other areas around the world that are dealing with war or something similar to war or genocidal acts by powerful countries that the United States tends to support in the case of Israel-Palestine. So there are all these instances around the world where human suffering is at an incredibly high level, and it gets no attention whatsoever while we hyper-focus on Ukraine. And I really want to be clear, you guys, I don't say that to minimize. My heart goes out to people in Ukraine. It's absolutely awful what is happening to Ukraine. I've discussed this every week since the invasion, and I see two sets of bad guys here, and I see Ukrainian people suffering. I'm not trying to minimize that at all, not whatsoever. What I'm trying to do is bring all of these other people around the world who you may notice happen to be more brown and black into that same discussion and to that same level of prominence and importance, where the media tends to not give them that same courtesy or that same import, right? They hyper focus on. I showed the Adam McLeod tweet thread where he found all the examples of Western press outlets admitting that the reason they care so much about Ukraine is that they are racist, right? The one guy said this hits home because it's kids with blonde hair and blue eyes. That's a BBC reporter that said that. So, Syrian children be damned, Somalian children be damned, Palestinian children be damned, Yemeni children be damned. Fuck them. Who cares? They're not kids with blonde hair and blue eyes. It's outrageous. They're very overt in their racism. And, I just want to make sure that we're talking about these things in a more objective way than the Western press tends to. So again, potential good news there in Yemen. I hope the ceasefire holds. I hope there is progress towards peace in the region. The Yemeni people, it's long overdue for them. They've been dealing with hell for very many years at this point. And, once again, if we want to condemn Putin for his war crimes, we should also condemn our own leaders for theirs. And that very much includes the attempted genocide of the Yemeni people. We got a story here in The Intercept about widespread homeless sweeps across the country. This is by Natasha Leonard. With sweeps of homeless encampments, liberal cities wage war on poorest residents. New York's Eric Adams became the latest mayor to clear out unhoused communities, a cruel reminder of how the liberal establishment fails the neediest. From New York City to Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon, and Washington, D.C., a growing list of major cities across the country are escalating a brutal war on their poorest denizens. No policy makes this clearer than the recent and aggressive sweeps of homeless encampments nationwide without any serious options for safe long-term shelter, let alone permanent housing. In New York City alone, Mayor Eric Adams in March ordered the clearance of hundreds of homeless encampments. He recently announced that 239 of 244 sites had been removed, primarily in Manhattan. With hardly any notice, dozens and dozens of unhoused people saw their tents, mattresses, and makeshift shelters swept into garbage trucks. The mayor's claim that these sweeps are about moving individuals into safer shelter was immediately belied by the fact that only 5 people whose encampments were destroyed have accepted a shelter bed. In Seattle, after a weeks-long standoff between police and activists attempting to protect a homeless encampment, cops cleared the space on March 2nd. Los Angeles has seen multiple sites where unhoused people erected temporary shelters swept away this year in militarized raids. Dozens of encampments have been cleared in Portland. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, at least 65 U.S. cities are criminalizing or sweeping encampments. Many of the major cities carrying out sweeps are under Democratic leadership, a grim reminder that Necropolitical population management is a bipartisan approach, and they have a lot of targets and victims in their war. Over 500,000 people across the U.S. experience homelessness on any given night, while a number of politicians from the Democratic Party's left flank, including New York State Senator Julia Salazar and New York City Council member Jennifer Gutierrez, have criticized the violent displacement of unhoused communities. The liberal establishment continues to pledge allegiance to market forces. Meanwhile, policies that criminalize poverty, from the war on drugs to the penalization of panhandling, create a steady flow of bodies into the glutted, prison industrial complex, creating a near inescapable cycle of immiseration and incarceration. And there's Eric Adams. None of the excuses given for carrying out these cruel policies hold any water. Each and every mayor who has enforced encampment clearances has made claims to public safety, citing upticks in crime and alleged concerns for unhoused people themselves. Another tie-in to all of those threads from Alec Karakatsanis that I'm bringing you all the time is the way that the homeless situation is addressed by public office holders. They often use crime to justify their cracking down on poverty and on homelessness. In New York, Adams' disdain for the unhoused has been laid bare. This is the right thing to do because there is no freedom or dignity in living in a cardboard box under an overpass. Oh, but there's freedom and dignity in taking away what little those people have, Eric. There's freedom and dignity in you taking the little that they have. You think that's dignified? Oh, fucking A. He said last week, claiming that it would take time to build trust such that unhoused people would accept shelter beds. Given his already young record, Adams' remarks about dignity are laughable. He cut $615 million from the city's homeless services agency, a fifth of its operating budget, while dramatically increasing the policing of homelessness on the subways. He has referred to homelessness as a cancerous sore. He also, by the way, appointed his brother to deputy commissioner of the NYPD and a known corrupt cop to be his top advisor that is a liaison of sorts between his administration and the NYPD. So that's who Eric Adams is, and that's why he's funding police and insisting that the issue of homelessness be addressed by police, even though police do nothing but make it worse. Unbelievable that he would sit there and try to sort of prey on and exploit our compassion for homeless people by saying, oh, well, that's not dignified. Of course it's not dignified, Eric. So put them in a fucking house, my dude. If you actually want to help these people, if you actually care about their dignity as human beings, give them shelter instead of taking away what little makeshift shelter they have. What an outrageous misrepresentation of the situation. What an outrageous frame job from Eric Adams there. I apologize. I got a little worked up, but that kind of fucking pisses me off, and I think it should piss the audience off too. I am from the Seattle area. I have seen this stuff close, up front. I've seen the gentrification. I have seen that the upper class only seems to give a fuck when you clear camps and then the homeless people are actually living on the sidewalks that the rich people have to walk by. Then all of a sudden we care about homelessness. Oh, God forbid I have to see the homeless on my way to work. But, doesn't matter if they're out of sight. I have seen how disgusting the response to the homelessness crisis and the gentrification is up front. As someone who I was raised about 20 minutes east of Seattle. My dad works downtown. I've seen it, and now we're seeing this in LA. We're seeing this in New York. We're seeing this in DC, et cetera, et cetera. Just anyway, that should piss you off is what that should piss you off. And again, I just want to tie it back into the propaganda and stuff that Alec is always talking about. Similar dynamic with this, right? The misuse of crime statistics, the misrepresentation of crime is used to crack down on the poor, crack down on the homeless, crack down on people who struggle with substance abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Eric Adams, as an ex-captain of the NYPD, capitulating to the police narratives here. Unsurprising, but no less egregious. Just disgusting stuff from Eric Adams there and mayors all across the country. We have a story here that brings me absolutely no pleasure whatsoever to share with you guys. In fact, it brings me a great deal of sadness to share with you guys. Black Lives Matter has kind of been caught misusing funds here. This is in New York Meg. Black Lives Matter secretly bought a $6 million house. Allies and critics alike have questioned where the organization's money has gone. This is by Sean Campbell. I do want to point out that one of a former Black Lives Matter organizer accused Sean Campbell of being anti-BLM and basically said that he shouldn't be treated as a credible reporter. That's just for context, you guys. They also called Sean misogynistic and racist. Sean is a black man, for whatever that is worth. Not that that belies their point, but I just want to give the context to the audience. On this story, there has been a response from some of the Black Lives Matter organizers to this, but it does seem like there's evidence that there was some misuse of funds here. So we're going to get into the details. And again, you guys, this brings me no pleasure at all. I'm a huge supporter of Black Lives Matter, and I hate seeing a movement like this be potentially undercut by a misuse of funds like this, right? It's also worth noting, again, before we dive in here, that the initial complaints here actually came from some of the lower level organizers and from parents who had lost their children to police violence, who questioned the way that their donations were being used and asked Black Lives Matter to stop using their name in Black Lives Matter's activities. Okay. So I want to try to provide the context here before we get into the details. On a sunny day late last spring, 3 leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Melina Abdullah, sat around a table on the patio of an expensive house in Southern California. The women were recording a YouTube video to mark the first anniversary of George Floyd's murder, and they discussed their racial justice work and the difficulties they had faced over the year. Quote, "For me, the hardest moments have been the right-wing media machine just leveraging literally all its weight against me, against our movement, against BLM, the organization," Cullors said. "I'm some weeks out now from a lot of the noise, so I have more perspective, right? While I was in it, I was in survival mode." She was referring to an April 2021 article in the New York Post that revealed her purchase of 4 homes for nearly $3 million. The disclosures had contributed to the idea that there is a disturbing gap between the fortunes of the movement's most visible figures and on-the-ground activists across the country, and Cullors resigned as executive director of Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation on May 27th, within a few days of the patio chat. Quote, "I think they've attempted to cancel us, but they have not been successful in canceling us," Abdullah said at another point in the conversation. "They've attempted to say, and I'm just going to say it, she bought some damn houses, we going to cancel her." Garza cut in with a comment seemingly addressed to critics. Y'all don't know shit about what it takes to live in a box here." None of the women acknowledged the house behind them. It's far from a box, with more than 6,500 square feet and more than half a dozen bedrooms and bathrooms, several fireplaces, a soundstage, a pool, and bungalow, and parking for more than 20 cars, according to real estate listings. The California property was purchased for almost $6 million in cash in October 2020 with money that had been donated to Black Lives Matter. The transaction has not been previously reported, and Black Lives Matter's leadership had hoped to keep the house's existence a secret. Documents, emails, and other communications I've seen about the luxury property's purchase and day-to-day operation suggest that it had been handled in ways that blur or cross boundaries between the charity and private companies owned by some of its leaders. It creates the impression that money donated to the cause of racial justice has been spent in ways that benefit the leaders of Black Lives Matter personally. There are a lot more details there, you guys, but it certainly seems, some of the communications that they discuss were essentially organizers trying to come up with a way to justify the purchasing of the house. It seems pretty obvious that spending $6 million on a mansion, I mean, I've seen the pictures of it, is a misuse of funds that were donated by people who were hoping to help, combat police violence and racism in law enforcement and the justice system. That seems pretty inappropriate. And I really hate to bring you this story, you guys. I don't want to see this. I don't want to see an organization that I support engaging in this kind of conduct and then see the movement sort of face a repercussion for that. I don't want to see that, but that's quite possibly what's going to happen here. I also wanted to share another piece that just sort of, this is from February, but it talks a little bit about how some portions of Black Lives Matter may have been sort of co-opted by the establishment. This is in the Washington Examiner. Revealed Clinton world takeover of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter filings revealed prominent Democratic lawyer Mark Elias and another longtime ally of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have taken on key roles in the charity amid scrutiny over its leadership and finances. Elias, best known for his funding of British ex-spy Christopher Steele's discredited anti-Trump dossier while he served as Clinton's 2016 campaign general counsel, appears to be representing the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation through his recently formed Elias Law Group. BLM's national organization repeatedly lists the Elias firm as one of its addresses and states in its short year 2020 Form 990 that its books were now in the care of the Elias Law Group. So you hate to see this stuff, you guys. It's a movement I wholeheartedly and full-throatedly support, and you just hate to see an institution that is fighting a good fight engage in some behavior like this that sort of discredits the movement more broadly. $6 million on a house. It's just there's very few ways you could spin that to me where I would think that was remotely appropriate or acceptable to use funds from a charity in that manner. So not a great story, guys. Not a fucking great story. We need to keep this movement alive, and we need to be honest about the actors that participate in any given movement. So when someone does something like this, it discredits all of us if we don't call it out, which is why I'm calling it out. It's a cautionary tale for organizers and activists, and it's just a really unfortunate thing for the civil rights movement, for the left, for the defund the police movement, etc. Again, I hope to see that movement make progress, that in coming months and years, and I think it's really sad that Black Lives Matter had some of their organizers engage in this kind of conduct. I once again want to give the caveat that some of their organizers did object to the author of that piece and say that he had bias. Just context for the audience. Do with that what you will. So we have another story here. This is in Real Progressives, realprogressives.org, for all of our fantastic content, including articles here. This is by Caitlin Johnstone. For those who don't follow her, she's excellent. She's an Australian journalist. She often covers American stories, though. International law is a meaningless concept when it only applies to U.S. enemies. Australian whistleblower David McBride just made the following statement on Twitter. I've been asked if I think the invasion of Ukraine is illegal. My answer is, if we don't hold our own leaders to account, we can't hold other leaders to account. If the law is not applied consistently, it is not the law. It is simply an excuse we use to target our enemies. We will pay a heavy price for our hubris of 2003 in the future. We didn't just fail to punish Bush and Blair, we rewarded them, we re-elected them, we knighted them. If you want to see Putin in his true light, imagine him landing a jet and then saying, mission accomplished. As far as I can tell, this point is logically unassailable. International law is a meaningless concept when it only applies to people the U.S. power alliance doesn't like. This point is driven home by the life of McBride himself, whose own government responded to his publicizing suppressed information about the war crimes committed by Australian forces in Afghanistan by charging him as a criminal. Does that remind you of anyone perhaps named Julian Assange? Neither George W. Bush nor Tony Blair are in prison cells at The Hague, where international law says they ought to be. Bush is still painting away from the comfort of his home, issuing proclamations comparing Putin to Hitler and platforming arguments for more interventionism in Ukraine. Blair is still merely warmongering his charred little heart out, saying NATO should not rule out directly attacking Russian forces in what amounts to a call for a thermonuclear world war. They are free as birds, singing their same old demonic songs from the rooftops. When you point out this obvious plot hole in discussions about the legality of Vladimir Putin's invasion, you'll often get accused of whataboutism, which is a noise that empire loyalists like to make when you have just highlighted damning evidence that their government's behaviors entirely invalidate their position on an issue. This is not a whataboutism. It's a direct accusation that is completely devastating to the argument being made, because there really is no counter argument. The Iraq invasion bypassed the laws and protocols for military action laid out in the founding charter of the United Nations. The current U.S. military occupation of Syria violates international law. International law only exists to the extent to which the nations of the world are willing and able to enforce it. And because the U.S. empire's military power, and more importantly, because of its narrative control power, this means international law is only ever enforced with the approval of that empire. This is why the people indicted and detained by the International Criminal Court are always from weaker nations, overwhelmingly African, while the U.S. can get away with actually sanctioning ICC personnel if they so much as talk about investigating American war crimes and suffer no consequences for it whatsoever. This next point is devastating for those that don't know it. It is also why in 2002, the Bush administration instituted what became known as the Hague Invasion Act, saying military force will be used to liberate any U.S. or U.S. allied military personnel from an ICC attempt to prosecute them for war crimes. It is also why Noam Chomsky famously said that if the Nuremberg laws had continued to be applied with fairness and consistency, then every post-World War II U.S. president would have been hanged. That is one of my favorite go-to lines. I'm sure you all have heard me say that dozens of times. This is also why former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton once said that the U.S. war machine is dealing in the anarchic environment internationally where different rules apply, which does require actions that in a normal business environment in the United States we would find unprofessional. Bolton would certainly know. In his bloodthirsty push to manufacture consent for the Iraq invasion, he spearheaded the removal of the Director General of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, a crucial institution for the enforcement of international law, using measures which included threatening the Director General's children. The OPCW is now subject to the dictates of the U.S. government, as evidenced by the organization's cover-up of a 2018 false flag incident in Syria, which resulted in airstrikes by the U.S., U.K., and France during Bolton's tenure as a senior Trump advisor. The U.S. continually works to subvert international law enforcement institutions to advance its own interests. When the U.S. was seeking UN authorization for the Gulf War in 1991, Yemen dared to vote against it, after which a number of the U.S. delegation told Yemen's ambassador, "That's the most expensive vote you ever cast." Yemen lost not just $70 million in U.S. foreign aid, but also a valuable labor contract with Saudi Arabia, and 1 million Yemeni immigrants were sent home by America's Gulf state allies. Since observation of who is subject to international law enforcement and who is not makes it clear, the very concept of international law is now functionally nothing more than a narrative construct that's used to bludgeon and undermine governments who disobey the U.S. centralized empire. That's why in the lead up to the confrontation with Russia, we saw a push among empire managers to swap out the term international law with rules-based international order, which can mean anything and is entirely up to the interpretation of the world's dominant power structure. It is entirely possible that we may see Putin ousted and brought before a war crimes tribunal one day, but that won't make it valid. You can argue with logical consistency that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is wrong and will have disastrous consequences far beyond the bloodshed it has already inflicted. But what you can't do with any logical consistency whatsoever is claim that it is illegal, because there is no authentically enforced framework for such a concept to apply. As U.S. law professor Dale Carpenter has said, if citizens cannot trust that laws will be enforced in an even-handed and honest fashion, they cannot be said to live under the rule of law. Instead, they live under the rule of men corrupted by the law. This is all the more true of laws which would exist between nations, We don't get to make international law meaningless and then claim that an invasion is illegal. That's not a legitimate thing to do, as long as we are living in a Wild West environment created by a murderous, globe-spanning empire which benefits from it. Claims about the legality of foreign invasions are just empty sounds. Excellent piece there from Caitlin. Again, realprogressives.org, you guys, for all sorts of fantastic content. And I also want to just give a quick little plug. We are always looking to add to our writer team. If you or anyone else might be interested in joining Real Progressives as a writer, please also go to realprogressives.org and reach out to us through our website. We are always looking to find more writers to add to the team and put out more content for you all. So encourage everybody to get involved if you're interested there. I once again, you guys, I want to plug the March for Medicare for All basket and their donations. There is that event on July 30th that is going to be preceded by a week of action in DC about national improved Medicare for All. And I also want to plug very quickly, this is on March for Medicare for All's website, m4mforall.org, if you guys want to learn more about them. This is about a filing, they're filing a United Nations violation, basically saying that the United States is in violation of international law by not providing their citizens with health care. If you scroll down on their homepage a little bit, you get to this portion. I'm just going to read this very quickly. We are filing the United Nations violation. Tell us your story. We know providing comprehensive quality healthcare to everyone in the United States is the right thing to do. It is the duty of our government to provide for our health. What could be more essential to a prosperous country than that country providing for the health of its people? If you believe, as we do, that healthcare is a human right, then you must agree that by our country willfully not providing that care, they are violating that right. We are gathering personal stories of struggle caused by this terrible human rights violation to present to the United Nations. We have been trying for decades to remove this embarrassing stain from our international face. It's high time the world knows where the people of the United States stand on this matter. We are suffering and dying every day because of the inefficient and cruel for-profit insurance industry. Enough is enough. We all see it now, and we are telling the world. For those who caught the summit, with March for Medicare for All a few weeks ago, the panel that I hosted with Martha and Mary was about this, and Martha and Mary are two of the attorneys who are heading this effort. Encourage you all to go check that out if you missed it, and I encourage you all to share a story for March for Medicare for All if you're interested in helping that effort out. Again, it's m4mforall.org. And I once again want to plug you guys. They're doing another raffle here. If you donate, every $10 that you donate gets you a raffle ticket to win a pretty awesome basket here. So m4mforall.org/donate if you would like to help them out. And I also encourage everybody to get involved that week in July, culminating with the event on July 30th in Washington, D.C. If you're in the D.C. area, look into this event and perhaps start planning, making yourself available, that kind of thing. Go to m4mforall.org for more information on all of their organizing and events upcoming. And with that, you guys, I will call it a show. Once again, realprogressives.org. If you want to learn more about us or support us, realprogressives.org/donate. We really appreciate all of the help. Please do smash that like button. Please share this content. Leave a comment. Make sure you're subscribed here and on our other channel, Real Progressives. And I hope that you all have a fantastic week. I will see you again next Sunday at the regular time, 5 Eastern, 2 Pacific.